On Friday, May 2nd, 1806, the ninth child and second daughter was born to Pierre Laboure and his wife, Louise Madeleine Gontard, in their farmhouse at Fane-les-Moutiers. At her baptism next day she was christened Catherine, but her parents added a second name, Zoe, in honor of the saintly martyr on whose feast day she was born. By this short, homely second name, Catherine was always known to her family. The Laboure farmstead was a large one situated on a plateau in the countryside called Fane-les-Moutiers. Beneath, in the plain, stood the village of Moutiers-Saint-Jean with its once famous monastery deserted and desolate since the reign of terror of the Revolution. Pierre Laboure, a prosperous, thrifty, hard-working farmer, had spent some time in a seminary studying for the priesthood. But he returned to the world, whether of his own accord or swept back by that tidal wave of revolution which devastated the religious centers of France, is not certain. He turned to farming, and in this calling his industry and thrifty way of living won for his large household a comfortable competence. He took an active interest in local affairs and was mayor of the district from 1811 to 1815. His wife, Louise Gontard, was a well-educated woman of good family. She was a teacher in Seignelay before their marriage in 1793. She died at the early age of 42, leaving to their bereaved father 10 surviving children, 7 sons and 3 daughters whom, in that age of scepticism and irreligion, she had been rearing on true Christian principles, according to conscience and honor. Zoe was 9 years old when her mother died in 1815. The family was scattered by this tragedy. Pierre Laboure kept his eldest daughter, Marie-Louise. At his side, she had been excellently educated by the Sisters of Charity at Langres and was 20 years old to take charge of the housekeeping. His eldest son, Hubert, aged 17, joined the army, where he was destined, in time, to carve out a brilliant military career. Jacques went to a wine merchant in Paris. Charles and Anthony went also to Paris, Charles to learn the catering trade, with a view to opening his own business in due course, Anthony to be apprenticed to a chemist. Joseph and young Pierre were sent to school. Zoe and her little sister, Marie Antoinette, always called Tonine, went to stay with their aunt, Madame Jeanrot, comfortably married to a vinegar merchant in Saint-Remy. Auguste, the baby of the family, he was only 6 years old, and very delicate, stayed at home under the care of the governess who had helped Madame Laboure with the children, and remained on to help Marie-Louise. Zoe and little Tonine spent 2 happy years with their 4 small cousins in Saint-Remy. Strange to say, they were not sent to school. Zoe, in actual fact, never went to school, not even on her return to Fane. At Fane there was a boys' school, only the girls of the district went to the school of the Sisters of Charity of St. Vincent de Paul in Moutiers-Saint-Jean, some half an hour's walk. For whatever reason, Zoe never attended the classes of the sisters. She remained untutored until almost her middle 20s. No doubt her mother, helped by the governess, had given the children some elementary instruction. The older ones had been educated with care and attention. Tonine learned, later, to read at her father's knee. Zoe, alone, remained neglected in this regard, the only one of 10 children deprived of education. Was there in this strange coincidence a special act of providence? It is a delicate point. But knowing now the divine plans in her regard and the great favors for which her soul had been selected, one thinks involuntarily of St. Paul's inspired words, "The foolish things of the world hath God chosen that he may confound the wise. And the weak things of the world hath God chosen that he may confound the strong. And the base things of the world and the things that are contemptible hath God chosen and the things that are not, that he might bring to naught things that are, that no flesh should glory in his sight. Such is God's way," wrote Henri Guion of the Cure of Ars. "The humbler the instrument, the greater is his glory." Zoe was just 12 years old, the usual age for country children to begin work, when her father recalled his 2 little girls from Saint-Remy. There was good reason for this move. Marie-Louise, now 22, had long cherished a desire to enter with the Sisters of Charity of St. Vincent de Paul. The death of her mother delayed her plans, but at last her father had consented, provided that she left in her place someone capable of managing the house. It was decided that Marie-Louise would train Zoe to take her place, with the help of a servant. Tonine also would help. Zoe's words to her father on her return to Fane have been preserved to us. Making a movement of her head to include Tonine, she said, "Between the 2 of us we shall be well able to manage the house." No idle boast this, when we consider how well she managed for 10 long years, rising early, preparing meals for the household and the farm workers, for Pierre Laboure employed about a dozen laborers to help him, making beds and cleaning rooms with meticulous attention. Looking after her little sister, mending clothes and linen, watching and renewing food supplies, serving her father at table, bringing meals at harvest time to the men in the fields, tending the poultry, and sweetest of all her homely duties, feeding the pigeons in the dove tower. Tonine, to whom we are indebted for almost all we know of our saint's childhood and early girlhood, has left us a pretty word picture of this scene. Zoe, bringing the grain towards the old tower in the farmyard, is met by a whirlwind of winged creatures who swoop upon her in a cloud of blue and white and gray. Laughing, she lifts her arms to ward off pale pink feet from her head, her shoulders, her face. "Rascals, you're pulling down my hair," she cries. There were 700 or 800 pigeons to be fed. And Tonine, watching this gay spectacle with the fascinated eyes of a younger sister, stood nearby in the yard. It was a charming sight, she remembered, in later years. Tonine, who was to become Madame Miut, mother of the Vincentian Father Mugniot, has preserved many a little memory of the years she spent so intimately with her sister. Zoe, by nature a silent girl with a deep inner life burning ardently, hidden from all eyes, seldom gave any confidence to her beloved little sister. But Tonine, gay, lively, extrovert, noticed, perhaps unconsciously, many a small detail, or came suddenly upon an occasional little secret which she treasured in her heart. It was the servant who told Tonine that she, unnoticed, had seen 9-year-old Zoe climb upon a chair to reach a statue of the Blessed Virgin in the living room. Zoe hugged the statue in her childish arms, covered it with kisses, and told Our Lady that she would have to take the place of the mother whom God had called away. But rarely, and then only when she could not hide it, did Zoe give any outward sign of the strong currents that swept her secret soul. In her, the hidden life of devotion was masked from mortal eyes by calm serenity and quiet application of energy to everyday duties. Years later, when the whole world was asking urgently who was the Sister of Charity to whom Mary had revealed the miraculous medal, only Zoe and her confessor knew the answer. Even her superior and the sisters with whom she lived daily, hourly, failed to detect that Sister Catherine, simple and silent, speaking only if spoken to, never writing, save on a rare occasion, was she whom heaven had chosen as its messenger of Mary. Zoe was in her 12th year when she made her first communion. She was prepared with other children in the parish of St. John les Moutiers, where she went for instruction each afternoon, the main work of the day done. For the Church of Fane had no resident priest and no services except the Sunday Mass. In Moutiers-St. Jean, the parish church, and the house of the Sisters of Charity of St. Vincent de Paul were situated. The great day came. Bells ringing out over the plain to the plateau, candles gleaming with chaste light on the altar, children in white gathered together and singing sweet hymns in childish treble. A saint-to-be is in their midst, one of themselves, who will get great graces from God and will respond with all the generosity of which the human heart is capable. Is there a miracle, an apparition, or even an ecstasy? No, nothing of that kind, nothing to set Zoe apart from her companions. Only that, to the keen eye, this gentle, quiet child may seem more wrapped in prayer, more lost to earthly things, more given to her Lord than any of the others. She was altogether a mystic, said Tonine years afterwards, with the mature experience of age. And again, she edified all who looked on her, but not for many years, was the real significance of this deep devotion made known to the world. At Fane les Moutiers, neighbors saw only a silent little girl, reserved, religious, whose hands were always busy with the heavy work of a large farmhouse. A few days after her first communion, Zoe gave one of her rare confidences to little Tonine. I, too, shall be a nun, like Marie-Louise. Not an unusual avowal, coming so soon after an event which elevates the soul of every devout child. But in Zoe's case, her resolution was to be tested by 12 long years of waiting, fraught with trial and obstacle. The goal, when seeming nearest, was to recede from her disappointed gaze. Her pilgrimage was to be strewn with thorns and briars, her burning desire of fulfillment to be threatened with extinction by floods of discouragement. Yet she held out with steadfast perseverance. What she wanted was worth fighting for, cost what it might. There was no hope of broaching the subject until Tonine would be ready to take over the housekeeping. But the years between could serve as an apprenticeship in holiness, and Zoe made them do so. She rose at dawn. Day began, many times a week, with early Mass at 5:30 or 6 o'clock in the chapel of the sisters in the plain below. Mass over, Zoe hurries back to the farmhouse on the hill, meeting many a worker starting for the fields. They pass the time of day. When she is in her later teens, the men with sons to marry let their eyes linger on her when she passes. The makings of a fine farmer's wife is their unspoken comment. A grand worker, thrifty, of a prosperous family. A little taciturn, perhaps. It's all the better in a woman, then comes the housework for the day. She is always bright and brisk, her brothers say, and does everything to perfection. No immoderate haste, no nervous hurry. This it is which gives her that air of calm serenity, almost of apathy. Apathetic was the very word applied to her by her confessor, years later before he had learned to read her soul. So perfect a mask for the depths of her hidden life. If it is summer and the workers are out in the fields, Zoe must pack a large basket and carry it to the hayfield or cornfield or to the vineyard. Bread, bacon and wine for her father and his assistants. She serves them carefully. The Angelus rings out on her return journey. The bell of Fane's old crutch is answered from the parish church, and Motier's saint. Jean and the chime from the convent of the sisters tunes in gladly. Hail Mary, full of grace. Be it done unto me according to thy word. And the word was made flesh. Zoe is learning to know, more and more deeply, that mother who has taken her earthly mother's place, and upon whose knees our saint will one day lay her hands in loving confidence. They are grand little housekeepers, these two sisters, Zoe and Tonine. Everything shines: the brasses, the old oak furniture, the mirrors. All the eyes of the countryside are on these orphan girls, so early deprived of their mother, so admirably filling her place as housekeepers. When Zoe is 16, they can dispense with the servant and do all the work themselves. Pierre Laboure is pleased with them, stern and severe, as were so many fathers in his day, and to this day in France, where the Roman tradition of family life still flourishes, he has little fault to find with Zoe, whom, to quote her brothers, he scolded but rarely. The venerable church of Fane was quite near to the Laboure farm. The Virgin Chapel, on the right hand, was called the Laboure Chapel, for it was occupied by the Laboure family at Sunday Mass. And here Zoe hurried each evening, the main work of the day over, the supper ready for her father's return. Here she knelt on the hard flags, unhelped by cushion, seat, or prie-dieu, wrapped in prayer, until it was time to go back and serve supper. Tonine went sometimes with her. And here on Sundays both girls came with their father to Mass, which, as is usual on the continent, was a sung Mass. One Friday, when Zoe was about 14, she came home from Mass in the village and said to Tonine, preparing the breakfast, "I shall not eat this morning." Such was the beginning of her strict fastings on Fridays and Saturdays, a mortification the source of which we cannot discover. Her confessor, the parish priest of Motier's St. Jean, would scarcely have enjoined so severe a practice on so young a girl. She did not read of it anywhere, for she could not read. Had she got the idea from some sermon outlining a saint's life? Perhaps, but her mind was made up. Thenceforth, on Fridays and Saturdays each week, this healthy young girl, with the healthy appetite of adolescence, wedded to hunger by hard work and the fresh air of the countryside, would mortify the flesh in a manner calculated to hurt hard. She had taken the first step in the asceticism of a mystic. She was wielding the true and tried weapon in the spirit's warfare against the flesh. The love of God, said St. Gerard Majella, time and time again, does not enter the soul if the body is full. Tonine, shocked by this rigor, pleaded in vain for a mitigation of its severity. She argued, Zoe, get ill constant hard work, fastings, early morning mass, sessions of afternoon prayer in a cold, damp church could not but harm her darling sister. But in vain. Tonine got angry. I shall tell father very well, do, was the non-committal reply. Pierre Laboure listened in silence to his youngest daughter's complaint. Then he dismissed her. One did not discuss such matters with a child. But he sent for Zoe and made his wishes quite clear. He desired her to discontinue this fasting. Who works deserves to eat, was his realistic comment. Do I fast? He inquired. And surely I am not a bad Christian. But Zoe did not cease her mortification. She looked upon her father's words in the nature of advice rather than a command. She continued her severe fasting, and Tonine, watching with awe, said no more. Obedience in youth and in the convent, Zoe practiced to an heroic degree. Is it too much to conclude that this mortification in which she persisted, despite her father's views, was on instruction from God, not the answer to a mere childish whim? In such a soul as was Zoe's, lifted far above the common measure, interior communication with her Creator is something not to wonder at but to expect. To outward eyes, this 19-year-old girl was good to look upon, sturdily built, of medium height, blue-eyed, calm-faced, brown-haired. Small wonder that, because of her family and appearance, offers of marriage from well-placed families were directed to her father. Each time he put the matter before her, but her reply was always the same: "I do not wish to marry." He was content. What better than to have this good, steady daughter to mind his house and tend, with filial affection, the closing years of his life? Tonine would marry, of a surety. That bright little girl, so gay, so full of fun, so talkative, was born for happy matrimony. She often teased Zoe, the curiosity of a younger sister prompting her questions. "Why won't you have him, Zoe? Will you not marry?" And always the same reply: "No, I shall never marry. When you are strong enough to manage on your own, I shall go into a convent." One night, when Zoe was almost 20 years of age, she dreamed a strange dream. So vivid was it that she remembered it always. She locked it in her heart, speaking of it to no one but her confessor until, when an old sister of 70, she told both the dream and its amazing sequence to her sister, Marie-Louise, who was then in the infirmary of the Rue du Bac. She dreamed that she was in the church at Fain, kneeling in the Laboure chapel to the right of the altar. An old priest appeared at the altar, put on his vestments, and began to say Mass. Every time that he turned around, after each Dominus Vobiscum, she saw his kind, intelligent face fixed intently on her own. Rapidly, as in dreams, the Mass drew to a close. And then the old priest, turning back to the sacristy, beckoned her to follow him. But she, gripped in a nightmare terror, although everything was calm and pleasant in the dream, rushed from the church, looking back over her shoulder all the while. The old priest remained there, standing still in the same place and watching her fixedly. Still dreaming, on her way home she went into a house to visit a sick woman. The old priest followed her into the room and stood behind her. And he said, "It is good to care for the sick." He added, "Today you run away, tomorrow you will come to me. God has his plans for you, never forget it." She woke up in an access of spiritual happiness. The sequel to that dream was soon to enter her life, with sharp significance. We shall speak of it later. In 1828, Zoe was 22. Tonine, now 20, agreed to take her place in full, and Zoe decided that the time had come to speak to her father, to tell him of the pressing urgency of her vocation. No longer willing to brook denial, her father was pained, astonished, angry. She wanted to leave him, to bury herself in a convent, like her elder sister whom he had not seen for years. "But had I married, you would have lost me, too. That's quite a different matter," was his reply. "You could have lived here, or come to see me often when I wished it. What? Give up another daughter to the nuns? I won't hear of it. Put it out of your mind." "You make me very unhappy," said Zoe in tears. But her father would hear no more. A shadow falls across the happy farmstead. Zoe is torn with grief. Tonine's heart bleeds for her. Pierre Laboure is angry, believing himself the injured one. Like many a father out of tune with his daughter's feelings, he adds 2 and 2 together and gets 5. He has the very solution to the problem. He will send Zoe to her brother Charles, the restaurant keeper in Paris. A complete change of environment from this dull countryside to the gay capital will take the girl out of herself, distract her from her wretched idea of entering a convent, give her a taste of worldly pleasure, for she knows nothing about life. Paris, it shall be, for Zoe. Another great trial falls upon her shoulders. A year of suffering lies before her. That is why, in Paris, in the autumn of 1828, we find her in an atmosphere of smoke and the smell of cooking, loud with the clatter of crockery and cutlery, noisy with the careless conversation of workmen. How far it all seems from her own quiet country home, her darling Tonine, her pink-toed pigeons, her apple trees and her poultry. And how much farther seems her cherished goal, that convent where, guided by rules and practices of holiness, her soul may lose itself in its creator. Hubert Laboure, eldest brother of Zoe and now a brilliant young officer of the bodyguard of King Charles X, had married his cousin, Jean Gontard. A charming girl of excellent education. She opened in Châtillon-sur-Seine, a small town outside Paris, a high-class school for young ladies. It was an elegant establishment patronized by the best-connected families of Burgundy. When Jean learned of Zoe's plight, she understood, with the keen insight of a cultured woman, her sister-in-law's stark misery. With a generosity characteristic of this stylish young matron, she invited Zoe to come to stay with her at Châtillon-sur-Seine. She also wrote to her father-in-law, asking his permission for the change. Zoe had evidently written through the pen of another to her sister, Marie-Louise, then in the House of Charity at Castel Saracen, for advice on her vocation. There is extant a long letter from Sister Marie-Louise Laboure to Zoe, rejoicing in the latter's wish to enter, and urging her to accept, for the time being, their sister-in-law's kind invitation. "I would like you to spend some time in her house," wrote Sister Marie-Louise, "so as to gain some education. You will learn to speak French a little better than in our own village. You will devote your attention to writing, arithmetic, and above all, to holiness, religious fervor, and love for the poor." Thus, when school reopened after the summer of 1829, Zoe found herself at Chatillon-sur-Seine, in her sister-in-law's boarding school for young ladies. A great change, this, from the noise and bustle of a workman's restaurant, but little, if any, more suited in its atmosphere to Zoe's simple soul. For now the contrast stood out painfully between the sturdy country cousin, unable to read or write, and the pretty little demoiselles, so competently tutored in the arts of coquetry and charm. These precocious little ladies learned to dance with grace, to hold a fan provocatively, to hand round, charmingly, a dish of bonbons, to pick up, daintily, a wisp of lace handkerchief from the floor. They studied mythology, the history of France in Gaudier's verses, and a smattering of astronomy. What use had Zoe for any of these superfluities? They held no place in the life of truth and sincerity on which she longed to embark. Her sister-in-law soon sized up the situation and did not ask Zoe to mix with these choice flowers of society. But it is thought that she studied reading and writing under one of the junior mistresses who took the lower classes. Meanwhile, Zoe lived in her sister-in-law's apartment and enjoyed much liberty of movement. Soon she discovered the house of the Sisters of Charity, on the right bank of the river, and one day she made bold to call there, with a view to discussing her vocation. She knocked at the door. The sister portress opened it. Zoe asked timidly for the superior and was led, courteously, to wait in the parlor. She had scarcely entered this room when a picture hanging on the wall arrested her eyes and made her tremble with surprise. It was a portrait of the old priest of her dream at Fane. There was no mistaking those distinctive features, that large forehead beneath the black skull cap, those wrinkled old eyes, keen, but gentle and kindly, that strong prominent nose, the pointed chin below those well-closed lips which smiled, ineffably, the smile of a soul burning with charity. This was none other than he who, in the dream, had watched Zoe intently, and, when she fled, followed and said to her, "Today you run away, tomorrow you will come to me. God has his plans for you, never forget it." Tumultuous emotion surging through her whole being, Zoe stood alone in the sister's parlor, her eyes riveted on the portrait. Soon the door opened. It was not the superior, it was her assistant, Sister Victoire Sejols. She merits special mention here, for she alone, among all the sisters who were to know and live with Zoe for many years, descried, beneath the outward calm, beneath the apparent indifference of this country girl, the burning fire of the mystic. Where others saw only a creature of ordinary caliber, Sister Sejols divined an extraordinary personality, vital, brilliant, consumed with love for God. Now these two, who were to remain firm friends in religion, met for the first time in the convent parlor at Chatillon-sur-Seine. Formalities over, Zoe could not wait further before asking, "Who is the priest in this picture, sister?" And Sister Sejols answered in no little amazement, "Why, my child, that is a picture of our own father saint, Vincent de Paul." Zoe left the convent, walking on air, scarce knowing where she went. No need for further doubts, now heaven had spoken. Although to outward eyes she was a young, unemotional country girl, inwardly her soul glowed in that joyous peace that passes all understanding. Sister Sejols had told her, "Come to see me whenever you wish." At her next confession, Zoe told the parish priest of Chatillon-sur-Seine, Father Prost, all about her dream and its amazing sequel. "My child," he said, "I believe in truth that the old priest of your dream was Saint Vincent de Paul, and that he calls you to join the community of the Daughters of Charity." Henceforth, Zoe spent much more time with Sister Sejols visiting the sick than in the school for young ladies. And some weeks later, Sister Sejols sought out the superior, Sister Caney, to say to her sister, "Please receive Zoe Laboure as a postulant. I assure you that it is a vocation after Saint Vincent's own heart." But her father's consent had still to be won. And here Madame Hubert Laboure showed again her spirit and her resource. She wrote to her father-in-law, putting the case clearly and cleverly before him. He, for his part, thought highly of his eldest son's charming, talented wife. Besides, Zoe had been gone from his house for more than a year. Tonine had filled her place to perfection, and now it did not seem quite so terrible to face the prospect of losing another daughter to the nuns. At last he gave in, but grudgingly. "Let her do what she likes," were his final words. "But not 1 penny will she get from me." "That will not matter," was Jean's spirited reply. "I can supply both the dowry and the trousseau." She was as good as her word, this charming, attractive sister-in-law, to whom Zoe owed her passport to heaven upon earth. The dowry was 672 francs, a goodly sum in those times, when a hard day's manual work earned a mere 6 sous. The little scene on January 22nd, 1830, when Zoe Laboure forsook the world for the convent, is well worth a moment's notice. There was no fuss, no celebration, no tears of parting, no speeches. Her sister-in-law went with her to the House of Charity of Chatillon-sur-Seine. In the mind's eye, we can see Madame Hubert Laboure wearing a huge hat, after the fashion of the day. Her coat, dark and chic with large gigot sleeves, reveals a stylish gown so well supported by petticoats that it foreshadows the crinoline. Zoe is wearing a simple violet silk dress and a large hat to match. Behind them, a porter bends beneath the weight of her trunk. They walk across the town, over the bridge, through the old Jewish quarter to the house of the sisters on the river's bank. Jean is smart, alert, businesslike. Zoe, soon to become Sister Catherine Laboure of the Sisters of Charity of St. Vincent de Paul, appears calm, unemotional. In reality, she does not feel her steps touch the ground. Her soul soaring above the earth in a rapture of joy, she leaves this world which she has never loved, to follow him in whom, alone, she can achieve fulfillment. The 4 months, January to April 1830, spent by Zoe as a postulant in the Sisters' House of Chatillon-sur-Seine, were but a simple training for her novitiate in the seminary of the Mother House in Paris. During these 4 months, she wore a black dress and kept her own name, Mademoiselle Zoe. She shared the life of the sisters, rising at 4 o'clock each morning, hearing Mass, joining in the religious exercises, sewing and doing house duties, and helping Sister Sejoles in her visits to the sick and the poor. There was no tie binding her; she could return home if she wished. These 4 months gave Zoe an opportunity to improve her very slight knowledge of reading and writing, and Sister Sejoles guided her in these matters. Under the rules of the sisters, those who had been given permission to learn to read could devote half an hour after dinner to this purpose, subject to the discretion of the sister servant. But such study time must always be kept open to interruption or cessation, should more important duties arise, nor could it ever be allowed to detract from the sister's service to the poor. In 3 months, thanks to these 2 or 3 hours per week of begrudged study, Zoe could read and write. No doubt her writing was, by school standards, elementary. Syntax, spelling, and penmanship left much to be desired. But she did well enough to be able, later on, to keep the poultry accounts at really, accounts that were a model of order and clarity, eloquent of the good head of the sister, and the exact precision with which she executed every duty, however humble. This exactitude and precision are shown, also, in her description of the apparitions which she wrote to the order of her confessor in 1856. One can find fault in plenty with the spelling, the penmanship, the colloquialism of the phrases, but the matter is clear and concise, expressed with the sureness of touch and accuracy of observation which argue a clear conviction, an unchallengeable verity in the mind of the writer. Her postulancy successfully concluded, Zoe left Chatillon-sur-Seine for the seminary in Rue du Bac, Paris. She was brought there on April 21st, 1830, within less than a fortnight of her 24th birthday, by a very old superior, Sister Hainaut. This old sister was journeying to end her days in the mother house of the community, where our saint's young soul was to plume its wings for a flight, a divine flight to which the eyes of the world would one day turn in awe and gratitude. It was Wednesday, the 21st of April, 1830, when Zoe, henceforth Sister Catherine Laboure, arrived in the Rue du Bac. We know the date from her own statement in the poorly penned but clearly worded account which she wrote for her confessor. Many years later, it was the Wednesday before the translation of the relics of St. Vincent de Paul. Sister Catherine, transported with joy to be able to assist at this great ceremony, declared, "I seemed no longer to belong to this earth." During the Revolution, nothing was sacred to the violent mob which swept Paris and France like a tornado. The dead, no less than the living, were despoiled and defiled. To give but one of hundreds of horrid examples, even that saint so dear to medieval and early modern France, Genevieve, whose shrine once stood in splendor on the site occupied, later by the Pantheon, had suffered horrible desecration. The church built by King Louis XV in her honor was barbarously defiled, her body torn from the tomb and burned, in public, in the Place de Grève, now the Place de l'Hôtel de Ville. Small wonder, then, that the sons and daughters of St. Vincent de Paul hid the precious remains of their founder, moving them from place to place whenever the danger of profanation became imminent. When peace and order had been restored by the Emperor Napoleon, the holy relics were brought, in 1806, to the mother house of the sisters, then situated in the Rue du Vieux Colombier. There they rested until 1815, when they were removed to the new mother house of the sisters in the Rue du Bac. Finally, in April 1830, at the instance of the Archbishop of Paris, Monseigneur de Quellin, and with the official sanction of the Holy See, the sacred remains of St. Vincent de Paul were reclothed in rich sacerdotal vestments and placed in a magnificent shrine of solid silver, which was then carried from the archiepiscopal residence to the Cathedral of Notre Dame de Paris. On Sunday, the 25th of April, there took place the solemn translation of the relics of St. Vincent from the Cathedral of Paris to the Church of the Vincentians in the Rue de Sèvres. The royal family, the civil authorities, and the army united with the church to impart to the solemn occasion a character of national importance. After Vespers at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, a procession of surpassing magnificence and religious devotion emerged from the cathedral. The procession was headed by military detachments. There followed the clergy, the bishops, the chapter of Notre Dame, the reliquary borne by 20 men clothed in albs and silken cinctures and surrounded by the priests of the mission. Behind the reliquary walked the civil dignitaries, the prefect of the scene, the chief of police, representatives of all the religious confraternities, 1,000 daughters of charity accompanied by orphan boys and girls from their various establishments. Finally, an immense crowd of people followed the procession. Amongst this huge throng walked Sister Catherine, transported in soul, transformed in outward appearance. Still calm and, as usual, recollected, she was now dressed in the novice's garb, a plain black cashmere bodice sewn at the waist to a full skirt of the same material around her shoulders, a white linen fichu on her head, a white close-fitting bonnet, like a small cornet, with a deep white band around the face, ending in 2 long streamers down her back, and over this head covering a thin black capote. A novice in black and white, Sister Laboure was but one of the many swallows of St. Vincent forming part of this mighty procession. The Sisters of Charity were, in this interval of respite between revolutions, recovering slowly but steadily from the eclipse they had undergone towards the end of the previous century. When Catherine Laboure went to the Rue du Bac, the mother house numbered only some 150 inmates, including active sisters, invalided sisters, and novices, sick persons, and servants. The group of buildings, joined together by gardens, was set in a crowded part of old Paris, somewhat less shabby than it appears today. The habit worn by the sisters was, by right, of a blue-gray color. But when they came together after their dissolution, it was found impossible to obtain the proper web for clothing the new members. Hence, these had to do with black habits. In 1833, Sister Belay, the Mother General, sought out a weaver on the verge of bankruptcy and advanced him enough money to tide over his crisis on condition that he would, in return, start weaving the proper blue-gray material, which he did. In Catherine Laboure's time at the Rue du Bac, the habits of the fully fledged sisters were black or blue-gray, according to the ages of their wearers. The novices wore their own style of dress, after a French fashion of the 17th century. The life of a novice, which Catherine followed for 9 months in the seminary in Rue du Bac, was in the nature of a retreat. No outside work was allowed to intrude upon prayers and meditations. Each day started at 4 o'clock in the morning with prayer, meditation, and Mass. During the morning, each novice had her allotted task: sewing, writing, or housework. At 11:30, particular examination of conscience at 2 in the afternoon, spiritual reading in the great silence at 3, the act of adoration at 5:30, meditation, and at 8 o'clock in the evening, night prayers. General examination of conscience and reading of the meditation for the following morning. The recital of the rosary during the day was obligatory. Sister Catherine followed all these exercises with the strictest care during the 9 months' probation. To her superiors, she did not appear outstanding in any particular. She spoke but little and in no way attracted special notice. She just passed as a simple and uneducated but devout country girl. Her record, written in the register of the seminary at the end of these 9 months, reads: Catherine Laboure, strong, of medium build. Can read and write passably. Her character seems sound. She is not outstanding in either intellect or judgment. She is devout and works well. Was ever novice given a more mediocre passport to her profession? Scarcely is she accredited with the minimum qualities necessary to make a good sister of charity. Her confessor, Father Aladel, a young priest aged 30, spiritual director of the Sisters of Charity, made no secret of the fact that during her novitiate, he had serious doubts of her suitability. Yet it was during those 9 months in the seminary that Catherine received the great favors from heaven which marked her soul as specially chosen to carry a divine message to the human race. It was in those 9 months that she had her prophetic visions of Saint Vincent's heart, that she saw, constantly, our blessed Lord in the Holy Eucharist, that she knelt beside and spoke with his Divine Mother and received from her instructions to introduce to a stricken world that wonder-working weapon known everywhere, for more than a century now. As the miraculous meddled all this time, none but her confessor knew of these great graces, and he, fearing that his penitent was suffering from delusions, paid little attention, for many months, to her startling revelations. The translation of Saint Vincent's remains was followed by a novena in the chapel of the Vincentian Fathers, which the novices from Rue du Bac attended each day of pontifical mass, panegyrics of the saint by the foremost preachers of the time, prayers and hymns. King Charles X, accompanied by the royal family, attended on one day. Sister Catherine was there on each of the 9 days, praying to Saint Vincent for herself, for his 2 families, the Fathers of the Mission and the Sisters of Charity, and for all France. Always she left the chapel in the Rue de Sèvres with the greatest reluctance. On her return to the Rue du Bac each day, Saint Vincent's heart appeared to her in visions. Before an altar on the right-hand side of the sisters' chapel, some relics of Saint Vincent were displayed in a small shrine. And during the evening meditation, Catherine saw the saint's heart form itself under 3 different aspects, each of which appeared on 3 successive days. The first time, the heart was flesh-colored, conveying to her an impression of quiet and innocence, symbolic of the interval of peace enjoyed by France at that time. Congregation of Saint Vincent would spread and become more fervent. The third aspect showed the heart a dark red color, foreshadowing fierce political upheavals, and a voice told Sister Catherine the heart of Saint Vincent is deeply afflicted by the evils which are about to fall upon France. Finally, on the last day of the novena, she saw the heart vermilion-colored, and a voice said to her, the heart of Saint Vincent is now somewhat consoled, because he has obtained from God, through the mediation of the Blessed Virgin, that the 2 families will not perish but will be used by God to revive the faith. To a girl like Catherine, completely devoid of interest in politics, this prophetic warning of disasters to come was inexplicable, save by extraordinary inspiration. She could read and write but poorly, and that only in recent months. She had spent most of her 24 years in the quiet of the countryside and had never turned her attention to political affairs. True, her father had taken part in local government and was mayor of Fane for a session. After supper at night, she may often have seen him reading the Paris Gazette and heard him make many a scathing comment on the incompetence of King Louis XVIII. But such topics were not for women, and least of all, for a young girl who wished to devote herself to the religious life. Yet in May 1830, with Paris and all France apparently basking in a spell of unusual peace and prosperity, she had these grim forebodings of turmoil in her beloved country. At home, Charles X seemed to enjoy the goodwill and confidence of his subjects. Abroad, the army of France had Algiers under full siege, and victory was expected at any moment. Hopes ran high, but Catherine, looking upon Saint Vincent's dark red heart, saw nothing but a presage of great evils for France, which cast their dark shadows heavily before them. At her next confession, her first to Father Aladel, and in the Rue du Bac, Catherine told her strange visions and sad forebodings. Imagine the scene. The timid young country girl, trying to express, in her homely Burgundian way, to each wonder she had witnessed the young priest, devout, ascetic, cultured, well-educated, prudent. He upbraided her sternly. "My child, put aside, I pray you, these figments of the imagination. They are temptations to pride. Devote all your attention to your duties in the seminary." So saying, he hastily closed the shutter, leaving Catherine dejected. From Ascension to Pentecost she made, with the other novices, a fervent retreat. She saw, constantly, our blessed Lord in the Holy Eucharist. "I saw him all the time I was in the seminary," she wrote in her official account, "except whenever I doubted having seen him, and thought I had deceived myself on June 6th, the feast of the Blessed Trinity. She saw him during Mass in the guise of a king with a cross on his breast. At the gospel it seemed to her that our Lord was despoiled of all his royal ornaments, which fell to the ground. This vision signified to her that the King of France would soon be dethroned. Events, however, pointed in quite the opposite direction. Algiers fell to the French on the 1st of July, and Paris triumphed with abandon. Had they heard it, political prophets would have laughed immoderately at the predictions of this untutored novice. How little they thought that the end of this same month, July, would reveal to a horrified people the ugly fermentations of revolution, already working their way upwards from the depths of dark plotting and scheming. Once more the Seine flowing under its low bridges would be made to run red with blood and to be wild with the light of torches. A great feast drew near that of St. Vincent de Paul on the 19th of July. On the eve of the feast, Sister Martha, one of the directresses of the seminary, gave to her novices an instruction on devotion to the saints in general, and to the Blessed Virgin in particular. It was to be the subject of their meditation on the following morning. After the instruction, Sister Martha cut up a piece of St. Vincent's surplice, which she had, and gave a tiny fragment to each novice. Tonight the desire to see Christ's mother sweeps over Catherine's soul with a wave of urgency. Him she sees constantly in the sacred host her, despite intense longings she has never beheld. Then she went to sleep, convinced that St. Vincent would obtain for her the great grace of seeing the Blessed Virgin that same night. She was asleep in her small iron bed, around which she had closely drawn the white curtains, when suddenly a voice awakened her. Sister Laboure, Sister Laboure, Sister Laboure, Sister Laboure. Looking out, she saw, near her bed, a small child of 4 or 5 years of age, clad in white, who said to her, "Come to the chapel. The Blessed Virgin awaits you." How could she rise without waking up the other novices who shared the dormitory? Should she go to the chapel, without permission, in the middle of the night? But before she could say anything, the child, perceiving her doubts, said, "Be assured. It is 11:30, all are asleep. Come, I am waiting for you." She dressed in haste behind the curtains, and went out to the child. He led the way from the dormitory, which was immediately above the sacristy, and down the stairs to the chapel. He kept to the left side, rays of light emanating from his person wherever he went. Everywhere, in the dormitory, on the staircase, in the corridor, all the lamps were lit, as though it were 9 o'clock at night. The chapel door was locked. The child opened it with a touch of his fingertip. To her amazement, the chapel itself was brilliantly bright, as though for midnight mass, with all the lamps and candles lit. The child led Catherine to the sanctuary, just in front of the altar rails, and beside the armchair of the director, that is, on the left hand or gospel side of the chapel. There was no sign of the Blessed Virgin. Catherine knelt down. The child remained standing. They waited for what seemed a long time, and no one came. At last, at about midnight, the child warned her, "The Blessed Virgin is coming." Then Catherine heard the frou-frou of a silken dress rustling on the epistle side of the altar, near the picture of St. Joseph. Lifting her eyes, she saw a lady of wondrous beauty come down from the tribune, bow low before the altar, and cross over to the director's chair, where she seated herself. Her robe of golden white, her exquisite blue veil, her attitude, all these reminded Catherine of the picture of St. Anne hanging in the choir. But the face was different. While Catherine was wondering whether this could really be Our Lady, the child read her thoughts. Speaking in the firm voice of a man, he asked her if the Blessed Virgin was not free to appear as she chose. There was no further doubt. "Following the emotion of my heart," wrote Catherine, "I knelt at her feet, joined my hands, and placed them upon her knees. There followed the sweetest moment of her life. She could never find words to describe what she felt. I do not know how long I stayed there. She had lost all count of time. After speaking with Catherine for a long time, the Blessed Virgin went away, vanishing like a shadow, in the direction whence she had come." Mary had told her many things in this interview described by Catherine as the sweetest moment of my life. She had explained in detail the meaning of the visions of St. Vincent's heart, which Catherine had already seen. She had pointed with her left hand to the altar steps, and had told Catherine to come there with all her troubles, prostrate herself, and pour out her heart. She would receive all the consolation she needed. "My child," continued Mary, "the good God wishes to charge you with a mission. You will suffer much, but you will bear it all with the thought that you are acting for His glory. You will understand what He desires. And you will be troubled until you have made it known to Him who has charge of your soul. You will be contradicted, but you will get the graces you need. Do not fear. Speak with confidence and simplicity. You will see certain things. Recount them to him. You will be inspired in your prayers. The times are evil, misfortunes are about to fall upon France, the throne will be overturned, the whole world will be convulsed by disasters of all sorts. The Blessed Virgin looked very sad when saying this. But come to the foot of this altar, here graces will be bestowed upon all who ask for them, the great and the small. My child, it delights me to shed my favors on the community, which I love dearly. But I am distressed because some abuses have crept into the two communities, and the rule is not strictly observed. Tell this to him who has charge of your soul. Even though he is not the superior, he will soon have charge of the community in a special way. He should do all he can to restore the rule in full. Tell him that from me. He should guard against useless reading, waste of time, and profitless visiting. When the rule is restored, another community will come to join yours. Tell him to accept the newcomers. God will bless them, and they will enjoy great peace. The community will grow very large. But grave danger will come upon it. It will seem as if everything is lost. Have confidence, I shall be with you. You will have the protection of God and that of Saint Vincent in both communities. There will be victims in other communities. The Blessed Virgin said this with tears in her eyes. There will be victims among the clergy of Paris. The Archbishop will die here. Her tears flowed anew. My child, the cross will be despised, it will be thrown to the ground, the side of our Savior will be reopened, the streets will run with blood, the whole world will be stricken. The Blessed Virgin could not continue, so great was her sorrow. And Catherine thought, pondering over these last mentioned, most terrible disasters, when will they come to pass? She heard an answer, "And 40 years. Then the Blessed Virgin vanished as she had come. The child spoke to Catherine, she is gone, he led her back to the dormitory, keeping her always on his right-hand side. The way was brightly lighted as before, and Catherine understood that this child was her guardian angel to whom she had prayed earnestly, many times, to get her the grace of seeing the Blessed Virgin. Back in bed, she heard the clock strike 2. As one would expect, she slept no more that night. It was no easy matter for Sister Catherine to speak of this vision to her confessor, after the very definite rebuff meted out to her some 6 weeks previously. But the Blessed Virgin had told her, you will be troubled until you have confided in him who has charge of your soul. You will be contradicted, but you will get the graces you need. Have no fear. At her next confession, she broached the matter timidly, but with conviction. Father, I must tell you that the Blessed Virgin has appeared to me. Immediately, Father Aladel's mind reverted to the visions of Saint Vincent's heart, which this young novice claimed to have seen in April. He repeated his instructions firmly. I have told you, my poor child, to pay no further attention to these figments of the imagination. Catherine was determined. Father, it is not imagination. I truly saw the Blessed Virgin in flesh and blood. She went on to tell him, in detail, of the apparition whilst he listened, perplexed and skeptical. The account given in this confession must have been much fuller than that which Catherine wrote years later by direction. Certainly she could express herself more fluently in speech than in writing, though in both she was frugal of words. Besides, 26 years later she had, no doubt, forgotten some of the details. We know that she foretold to Father Aladel much of what actually happened in the bloody revolution which suddenly flared into fire 8 days later. Our Lady, in teaching her the full significance of Saint Vincent's dark red heart, had revealed many imminent events connected with the sons of Saint Vincent. A bishop would come to seek refuge in the house of Saint Lazare. It might safely be accorded him, for the house itself would be spared from spoliation. Even the cross over the door would be respected. We know that Catherine told these things to Father Aladel because a week or so later, when they came to pass, he confided to Father Etienne, the director of both communities, that they had been foretold by one of the sisters. Naturally, under the seal of confession, he kept secret her identity. But listening in the confessional to Sister Catherine's amazing predictions, Father Aladel, unsuspecting what the future held in its fateful hand, adopted a cold, reserved attitude towards his penitent. She repeated Mary's words on the need for reform in the communities. She also told him that Mary had revealed the disasters that would fall upon France in some 40 years' time. Here, Father Aladel interposed a question. Do you know if you and I will be there? And Catherine replied, others will be, if we are not. No, Father Aladel was to die more than 3 years before the Commune of 1871 stormed Paris in yet another anti-religious revolution. Sister Catherine would live to take a prominent part on the side of its victims. But now Father Aladel, believing his penitent to be laboring under delusions, deliberately discouraged her from thinking further on these matters. And she, rebuffed again, went to pray at the altar where Mary had promised consolation. On July 27th, the storm broke without warning. The mob, identifying the throne and altar policy of Bourbon Charles X, now forced to fly into exile, with the clergy and the religious orders, turned the full force of its fury against them. Many of the religious houses were raided and wrecked and their churches despoiled. The cross, wherever found, was thrown down. The Archbishop of Paris, Mgr. de Quellin, fled into hiding under a disguise. Once again, Paris was barricaded, bombarded, beleaguered, the cannon roared in the streets. The dead lay unburied for days. The Vincentian house in Rue de Sèvres suffered several raids, but no depredation was done. One particular band of raiders came, determined to pull down the cross over the entrance door. But Father Etienne came to the door and received his rude visitors with such calm courtesy, such dignified authority, that they withdrew, overawed, without doing any damage. Thus did Saint Vincent, as foretold to Catherine, protect the welfare of his sons. Though the actual fighting ceased in a few days, there was much unrest, and the religious crisis continued for almost 2 years. An atmosphere of tension prevailed, and the Archbishop could not return openly to his duties until the middle of 1832. Meanwhile, the novices in the seminary of Rue du Bac continued their prayers and exercises as if everything were normal. No change was allowed to take place in the order of their day, but they were urged to pray harder. As for Father Aladel, one morning on his return to Rue de Sèvres, having said Mass in Rue du Bac, he learned that the Bishop of Hermopolis, Monsignor Freysinus, he had been Minister of Fine Arts in the last cabinet, was just leaving the house. He had come to seek refuge. But the superior feared that it would be most unsafe for Monsignor Freysinus to stay in Paris at all, and the bishop had decided to withdraw to Saint-Germain. Father Aladel thought again of Sister Catherine. Yet another of her predictions had come to pass. What manner of thing was this? Was it of God, or of the evil one, or was it a prophecy born of mere chance, a remarkably fortuitous coincidence? Bewildered, he waited for the next move. Doctor, Pumies de la Sibuti recollections dun Pavizieri. And Catherine herself. The Blessed Virgin had told her that she would be charged with a mission since then. No further revelation had given her any clue as to its nature. She waited, convinced that she would soon see Our Lady again. Day after day she lived in that ardent hope. Meanwhile, obedient to her confessor, she spoke no more to him upon the subject of her visions. The months of probation in the seminary passed by and Catherine remained, to outward eye, an ordinary novice, young, devout, but in no way outstanding. Summer came to an end. Autumn went by. And still the Queen of Heaven made no move to disclose to Catherine the mission of which she had spoken in July. It was Saturday, November 27, 1830, the Vigil of Advent. The novices were in the chapel at their evening meditation. All was silent in the black and white ranks of the little sisters-to-be. Suddenly, with an indescribable thrill of memory, Catherine heard the rustle of a silken robe on the epistle side of the altar, beside the picture of Saint Joseph. Lifting her eyes, she saw the Blessed Virgin there, beautiful beyond description. Striving to convey what no words can convey, Catherine tried, years later, to describe her. Our Lady was of medium height. She wore a golden white robe the color of the sky at dawn, cut simply with high neck and long plain sleeves. A long golden white veil fell down on each side to her feet. Beneath this veil, her hair was confined in a plain lace band. Her face, quite uncovered, seemed that of a woman of 40. It was very beautiful. Her feet, crushing a serpent, rested upon a globe, only half of which was visible, and in her hands, lifted waist-high, she held a much smaller globe. Her eyes were raised to heaven, and her face shone with light. Her fingers were covered with rings dazzlingly brilliant with precious stones. I cannot describe her beauty. It is the despairing cry of all who have been granted the grace of seeing Mary. No picture, no statue, by however great an artist, could ever express for Bernadette the true beauty of the lady she had seen at Lourdes. It was the same with Alphonse Ratisbonne, the wealthy young Jew, who owed his marvelous conversion to Christianity to the power of the miraculous medal. She is all beautiful, said the Portuguese children who saw Our Lady at Fatima in 1917. And the saintly priest of La Courneuve, Pierre Lamy, trying to describe his vision of Our Lady, said the only statue which is a little like her is that in Rue du Bac. where she is giving audience to Catherine Laboure. It is not quite right, and yet it is something like her. Humanly speaking, it is as good as it could be. Suddenly, the apparition was transformed before Catherine's eyes. The globe of the earth which Our Lady had been offering to heaven disappeared altogether. Her hands opened out and stretched downwards, letting fall those brilliant rays of light from her fingers onto the globe beneath her feet in such splendor that Catherine could no longer see either the Blessed Virgin's feet nor her robe. Then Mary's eyes looked upon Catherine, who heard a voice saying, "The globe which you see represents the whole world, and particularly France, and every single person. The rays are the symbols of the graces which I shed on those who ask me for them." Catherine suddenly understood how generous the Blessed Virgin is to those who pray to her, and how gladly she showers graces on those who ask her for them. "At this moment," wrote Catherine in her account, "I did not know whether I was alive or dead. All I knew was that I was very happy." Gazing enraptured, Catherine had her first vision of the miraculous medal. Around the apparition was formed an oval frame on which were written, in letters of gold, the words, "O Mary conceived without sin, pray for us who have recourse to thee." This inscription began at the top of the right hand, passed over the head, and ended at the top of the left hand. The picture was reversed, and Catherine saw, on the other side, the letter M surmounted by a cross with a bar beneath it. Under this monogram appeared the hearts. Eye of Jesus and Mary, one crowned with thorns, the other pierced by a sword. A garland of 12 stars inside the frame of the oval completed this picture. Again, a voice spoke, "Have a medal struck after this model. All who wear it, when blessed, will receive great graces, especially if they wear it around the neck. There will be graces in abundance for all who wear it with confidence." Then the vision vanished, leaving Catherine full of joy and consolation. Her mission had been made clear. She was to have a medal of her vision struck in honor of Mary Immaculate. Incidentally, by spreading devotion to the Immaculate Conception, she was to prepare the way for the great dogmatic definition of 1854. Next day, she saw Father Aladel to tell him of the Blessed Virgin's clear command, "Have a medal struck after this model." He received her coldly, listened to her account in critical silence, and, the recital over, enjoined her not to put faith in the vision. He did not hold out any hope that he would undertake the mission. "I confess," he wrote in 1834, letter to Father Leguilloa on the subject, without revealing the identity of the seer, "that I took it all to be a delusion of her pious imagination. I contented myself with speaking to her of true devotion to the Blessed Virgin, and pointed out that to imitate Mary's virtues is the best way to honor her and to ensure her protection." We can understand the dilemma of this young spiritual director, upon whom was being thrust, at second hand, through the medium of a young novice, the charge of having a new medal struck and a devotion propagated. He could not take any step in this direction without the approval of both his superior in religion and of the Archbishop of the diocese. Nor could he acknowledge these visions and commands until he became convinced that they emanated from a divine source. If they did so, time would tell, and no obstacle would be permitted to bar their eventual triumph. Meanwhile, he dismissed his penitent, telling her to pay no more attention to the matter. But for her, who had seen Mary in the splendor of glory, was such a direction possible of fulfillment, try as she might? To Catherine, praying in the chapel, the vision of Mary Immaculate shedding her graces upon the earth must have flashed, dazzlingly brilliant, upon her mind's eye with every ave. In the account which she wrote, laboriously, just before her death, appears this sentence: "Always thinking of the Blessed Virgin who had appeared to me, I believed that I would see her again. I lived in this thought. Before the end of 1830, the critical year in the history of Catholicism in France, Catherine Laboure saw the Blessed Virgin with her very eyes, in flesh and in blood, for the third time. The date of this third apparition of Mary is not known with certainty, but her biographers agree that it took place in December, and during the evening meditation in the chapel, Our Lady appeared as before, with a rustle of silken robe. This time she took her position behind the tabernacle, in the place now occupied by the statue commemorating the miraculous medal. Once more she revealed every detail of the design of the medal, and once more she urged her humble messenger to have it struck without delay and distributed throughout the whole world. Again, it was impossible to depict her beauty. "She was so lovely," wrote Catherine, "that I could not describe her beauty." Dressed as before, she held the globe in her hands, and Catherine understood that she was offering the earth to her son. To state what I learned during the offering is simply impossible. There followed the same transformation, the hands of Our Lady stretching downwards in an extension of love and generosity symbolized by the rays of light pouring from the brilliance of precious stones in her rings. This time a voice spoke in the depths of Catherine's heart. "These rays are the symbols of the graces I bestow upon all who ask her for them." Then the vision vanished, leaving Catherine in an ecstasy of JDG. Tormented afresh by the urgency of her mission, she sought out her confessor once more, in fear and trembling. He alone could undertake this charge. She could not take any direct action, and she had been instructed by the Blessed Virgin to confide in him only. No one else was to know of her visions, nor to whom the design of Themedal had been revealed by Mary. It was a secret kept by Catherine for 46 years, until just before her death, when, by divine instruction, she confided in her superior. All her long lifetime she never showed by word, glance, or attitude her intimate connection with that metal for which the world clamored as the sick for health. Father Aladel was to entreat her, time and time again, to take the seal of confession from his lips and allow him to disclose her identity, even in confidence, to the Archbishop of Paris. Her reply was always gently firm. "No, Father Aladel. The Blessed Virgin told me not to speak to anyone but you. To keep this secret over so many years required a motive nothing short of supernatural." But in December 1830, Father Aladel, harassed by this importunate novice, himself perplexed and torn by doubts and indecisions, temporized. Upbraiding her sternly for not obeying his instruction to think no further of this matter, he told her that she was foolish to indulge in the presumption that she had seen the Mother of God. Again, Catherine retired in defeat. But he was deeply disturbed by both her story and her attitude. The dogma of the Immaculate Conception had not yet been defined. 24 more years were to elapse before Pope Pius IX proclaimed this dogma to the Church. Yet this backward country girl had come to him with a perfect invocation: "O Mary, conceived without sin, pray for us who have recourse to thee," which unaided she would scarcely have devised. Discreet inquiries in the course of spiritual and general conversation with the superior, sisters and novices in Rue du Bac convinced him that Catherine had not given to anyone else the slightest hint of her remarkable experiences. He was impressed, but he reminded himself that the religious life can produce dangerous irregularities. The devil works hard to sow his seeds in this chosen ground. A spiritual director must go slowly, act prudently. Therefore, he temporized. In January 1831, her period of probation in the seminary was successfully concluded. With all the other novices who had come through this probation, Catherine laid aside the 17th century garb of the novice and was clothed in the holy habit of the Daughters of Charity of St. Vincent de Paul. With her companions, she would now be tested for 4 years in the works of the community before being allowed to take her vows of poverty, chastity, obedience, and service to the poor. Nothing out of the ordinary marked Sister Catherine's promotion from the novitiate. Nothing remarkable occurred to tell the world that here was a soul specially chosen by Mary. She herself was absolutely silent, and to her name entered in the seminary register was attached the unflattering comment already mentioned. On the 5th of February, she was placed in the kitchen of the Hospice d'Enghien in the Rue de Pipus. Here, in the suburbs of Paris, she was to spend almost all the remaining 46 years of her life, working at tasks so menial, so monotonous, so humble and wearisome that the worldly minded will wonder how she found life bearable. Not alone was it bearable, it was a magnificent, sustained, interior paean of charity made perfect by the triumph of her death. The Hospice d'Enghien was a house of rest for old retainers of the families of Enghien and Condé. It had been founded in 1819 by the Duchess of Bourbon as a memorial to her son, the unfortunate Duc d'Enghien, shot in 1804 in the ditches of Vincennes. There were some 50 old people in residence and 7 Sisters of Charity when Catherine first took up her duties in the kitchen. The hospice was joined by a long strip of common garden, with the house and school of the sisters in Rue de Rivoli, the same superior being in charge of both houses. In this group of buildings, Catherine was to spend almost all the rest of her long, obscure and lowly life. Father Aladel, in his capacity of spiritual director to the sisters of the community, continued to be her confessor, and she, as well as all the other sisters of Enghien and Rioli, went regularly to confession in the Rue du Bac. Indeed, the mother house was then, as always since, a magnet to the sisters, drawing them, whenever duties permitted, to pray in the chapel where their vocations had blossomed into flower. For Catherine, who had there seen Mary, Queen of Heaven, 3 times during her novitiate, the appeal of this chapel must have been irresistible. Here, during Mass, she saw her 3rd vision of the miraculous medal. The Blessed Virgin, dressed as before, beautiful beyond description, urged again that the medal be struck and showed her disappointment at the delay. Before she vanished, she said to Catherine, "My child, henceforth you will see me no more, but you will hear my voice in your prayers." For the third time, Catherine broached the subject of the medal to her confessor. This time, she was more insistent, more pressing in her pleas, more anxious at the delay in executing the orders of Our Lady. And this time, Father Aladel, overcome by sincere emotion, recognized that he had been withstanding, for almost a year, the wishes of the Mother of God. He asked Catherine whether she had seen any inscription on the reverse side of the medal, and, on hearing that there was none, told her to find out what should be inscribed. He had determined, at last, to take whatever steps he could to have the medal made and propagated. Catherine, after fervent prayer on this question, heard a voice telling her the letter M and the two hearts say enough. She reported this to her confessor.
And now Father Aladel spoke of the whole matter to Father Etienne, who, in these days of religious crisis, when the Superior General of the Vincentians had been forced to fly into hiding, held chief authority in Rue de Sèvres. Father Etienne, soon to become Superior General in his own right, was very much impressed by Father Aladel's account, though the identity of the seer was not made known to him then or later. He saw in Mary's revelations to this humble daughter of Saint Vincent a promise of sore needed help for the two families in the hour of darkness. He decided to call on Monseigneur de Quellin, Archbishop of Paris, still in hiding from the wrath of the revolutionaries, and to bring Father Aladel with him.
The two Vincentian fathers told the Archbishop all about the directions for the medal, Father Etienne introducing his junior and Father Aladel giving a full account of the apparitions, but keeping secret the name of the seer. To their delight, the Archbishop was warmly in favor of having the medal made and urged them to do so quickly. He held that the striking of this medal of Mary Immaculate conformed in all things to the faith of the Church and the belief of the faithful. It would not be an act too much out of the ordinary, nor would it involve the ecclesiastical authorities in any question as to the authenticity of the young sister's visions. He saw in the medal a proper method of honoring Mary, whose help was so sorely needed in those days of irreligion and atheism. Father Aladel, said the Archbishop, should free himself from all scruples in this matter and proceed immediately with the making of the medal, of which he, the Archbishop, was to get some of the first copies struck. In a word, Monseigneur de Quellin drew a clear line of demarcation between striking a medal in honor of Mary, conceived without sin, and the whole question of the authenticity of the visions. From that moment, Father Aladel, relieved of his doubts and scruples, gave wholehearted attention to the making of the medal. There were delays, indeed, that harassed Catherine's heart with torment and anguish in her failure to execute the commands of Our Lady. Some difficulty arose as to the attitude of the Blessed Virgin on the medal. Father Aladel was in favor of showing her with the globe in her hands, but the artist failed to illustrate this effectively. At last, the design so well known today was decided upon, that of Mary with her arms stretched downwards, rays pouring from her fingers as symbols of grace, a serpent crushed under her feet, and the invocation, "O Mary, conceived without sin, pray for us who have recourse to thee," inscribed in a semicircle around the frame. The reverse of the medal was to be exactly as Catherine had seen it in her vision. While these plans were going ahead, Father Aladel told the community at Rue du Bac about the apparitions in the chapel, taking care not to reveal the name of the sister who had seen them. His news was received with almost incredulous joy. He spoke of the medal that was being made, and the story spread like fire among the sisters. After all, nuns are women, and women have a special flair for news. Coming into the community room at Really one day, Father Aladel was surrounded by a sea of white bonnets quivering with curiosity. Father, tell us all about what happened in Rue du Bac." To his extreme embarrassment, Sister Catherine was amongst the sisters. How was he to answer without giving away her secret? He said a swift prayer to Mary for guidance, and aided considerably by the complete lack of self-consciousness and wholly normal behavior of Sister Catherine, mixing innocently with her companions and listening intently like all the others. Suspected by no one, he gave a simple outline of the prodigies. After that day, it seemed to him, as he wrote later, that the secret shared by both of us was pleasing to the Lord, who blessed the humble silence in which she took refuge and hid herself. Naturally, speculation was rife among the sisters as to the identity of the chosen one, but no one suspected Sister Catherine. That is, no one save Sister C. Jules, under whom Catherine had passed the 3 months of her postulancy in Châtellon-sur-Seine. Coming to Rue du Bac for her annual retreat and hearing the great news from the sisters, who vied with one another to tell her all they knew, Sister Sejoles made some shrewd calculations as to time and place. It can be none other than Sister Laboure was her verdict, received with tolerant smiles. That ordinary country girl who could scarcely read or write, who rarely spoke, who seemed so backward, so indifferent, who was devoid of spirit but good at milking cows. And Sister Sejoles folded up her own thoughts in her heart. It was the end of May, 1832, when, at last, an order the first for 20,000 medals was placed with Vachette's factory in Paris. On the 30th of June, the first delivery was made and Father Aladel hurried to Really to give one to Sister Laboure. What joyful peace must have descended upon this simple sister when she saw the first step of the mission safely accomplished with the making of the medal. "We must work hard to have it widely distributed," was her comment. Probably she was the first to wear it. We can imagine her in the oratory at Enghien that evening, wrapped in prayer to Mary, lost to all earthly ties, the medal burning like a white flame against her fast-beating heart. It was not long before the medal of Mary, conceived without sin, became known to millions of wearers as the miraculous medal. To recount the prodigies it accomplished both in the spiritual and temporal order would fill volumes. In 1855, Archbishop Ullathorne, in his classical treatise on the Immaculate Conception, wrote, "Except for the Holy Cross, no other Christian symbol was ever so widely multiplied or was ever the instrument of so many marvelous results. It has been in use just a quarter of a century and countless have been the favors, the graces, the preservations, the conversions, the miraculous interpositions of which it has been the occasion. In our own day, Pope Pius XI declared, the whole world has been filled with miracles due to the holy medal which, with reason, has been styled miraculous. The diffusion of this miraculous medal appears to us most marvelous. By means of it, God has been most generous in working countless miracles from the beginning of its propagation up to the present day. In the temporal order of prodigies, diseases of every kind, many of them incurable by human skill, disappeared with the application of the medal. Leprosy, tuberculosis, dropsy, epilepsy, even insanity, and a number of others. In the spiritual order, far more important, but far less striking to our worldly outlook, conversions and spiritual cures beyond number were effected. Protestants, Jews, apostates and atheists renounced their errors in favor of the true church. Hardened sinners repented with tears of sincerity and returned to the practice of virtue. The Archbishop of Paris, Monseigneur de Quellin, was among the first to receive a supply of the new medal. Immediately he set about testing its efficacy. There was in Paris at the time the constitutional Archbishop of Malines, Monseigneur de Prat, who had apostatized from Rome and had rejected every act of submission to the Pope. Now he lay ill, with death imminent, and it was thought inevitable that he would die impenitent, to the grave scandal of the faithful. Monseigneur de Quellin had made several attempts to see him and talk with him, but was always rebuffed. Taking one of the new medals with him, he approached the dying man's house once more. This time the Archbishop of Malines showed a complete change of front and ordered, to the shocked surprise of his friends, that the visitor be brought to his bedside. There Monseigneur de Prat recanted all his errors and heresies, and begged to be reconciled with God and with the Church. This accomplished, he died that very night in the true fold. Conversions and cures succeeded one another rapidly, through the mediation of the medal. Amazed by its remarkable power, Monseigneur de Quellin set up, in 1836, a canonical inquiry into its origin. The first demand of the president of the inquiry, the Abbé Oentine, was that he be allowed to hear the evidence of the sister of the apparitions. Father Aladel replied that this was scarcely possible, as she had refused her name to the Archbishop and had declined to meet him, even behind a veil, for Monseigneur de Quellin believed that, had he seen her or spoken with her, he could make up his own mind as to the origin, divine or human, of the medal. However, Father Aladel was told to try again. This time, to his astonishment, Sister Catherine declared frankly and sincerely that, even had she wished to do so, she could not give evidence, for she had forgotten all the details of the visions. The divine intervention of Providence to assist Catherine in her determination to shelter behind that heavy veil of her almost frightening humility, to avoid all publicity, all popular interest in her personality. Had she refused to disclose her knowledge before the Commission of Inquiry, it would have seemed like an act of obstinate pride, a selfish obstruction to the sincere search after truth. Divine aid came to her assistance, and she lost all remembrance of the great events of 1830. it was but a temporary loss of memory. In 1841, 5 years later, she was able to write to her spiritual director her first notes of the apparitions. Clear and vivid, they agreed with the verbal descriptions of 1830, of which Father Aladel had given evidence before the Commission of Inquiry of 1836. Father Aladel had, himself, made copious notes from her oral descriptions of the apparitions, but he destroyed these by his own hand before his death, lest their contents might become known to others while he was still bound by the seal of confession. Thus the inquiry of 1836 pursued its course, deprived of the chief witness, the central human figure of the miraculous manifestation, whose place was taken by her confessor. Little by little, every particle of evidence was sifted, and several claimed miracles were examined under the microscope of searching criticism. It was proved by statistics of production and distribution that in the 4 years of its circulation, more than 10 million medals had been propagated over the Catholic world. In Paris alone, 12 engraving factories were busy manufacturing the medal, while in Lyon 6 million medals had been made up to that time. The miraculous cures of corporal ills affected by the medal were numerous. The following are a few examples chosen from the records of the inquiry. Sister Marie Dowson, 29 years of age, in the Abbaye du Bois. Left thigh bone dislocated, leg paralyzed, shortened by fulfular inches, the foot turned in upon itself. 3 doctors delivered a serious prognosis the invalid would never be able to walk without crutches. On March 1, 1834, the medal was applied and the novena begun to Mary Immaculate. During the night of March 8th, the patient suffered a very painful spasm, as a result of which the dislocated thigh bone went back into place, the leg stretched to the proper length, and the foot rectified itself. The cure was perfect. After 3 days of convalescence, the patient was quite well again. It was a case unparalleled in the records of surgery. Madame Perron, a sick woman living in Bellefonte Street, Paris, was visited by Sister Laboure of the Sisters of Charity on October 10th, 1833. The sister, alarmed at the patient's condition, sent for a doctor, Dr. Parmentier. He diagnosed cancer and tuberculosis in its last stages. Madame Perron had been ill for 8 years, and Dr. Parmentier now ordered her to be brought to hospital. Her husband would not allow this. She was very ill on the following Saturday night, and death was expected at any moment. After Massachusetts on Sunday, Sister Laboure thought of bringing her a medal. She brought and applied it. The cure was instantaneous. The hemorrhages from which she had suffered for 8 years ceased altogether. Next Sunday, she was able to go to Mass. 3 sessions of the inquiry were held to examine this case: 1, to hear the evidence of Sister Laboure; another, to examine the neighbor who sat up with and tended Madame Perron during the night of October 10th, and had witnessed her sudden cure on the following day. The 3rd session heard the testimony of Madame Perron herself, now in the best of health. Julien Hertain, a hall porter, was stricken with a horrible illness which the doctors failed to diagnose. He suffered constant vomiting and stomach cramps which could not be alleviated. He was bedridden for almost 10 years, was frighteningly thin and emaciated. He was brought to the hospital of the Sisters of Charity on November 12, 1834. On Christmas Day, he got a medal and immediately began to recover. In 2 days, on December 27th, he was able to go home, completely cured. The inquiry devoted 4 sessions to the examination of this cure. But it would take a book of itself to recount the miraculous cures made through the medium of the medal, even between 1832, when it was first issued, in 1836, the date of the inquiry into its origin and effects. The inquiry, after a diligent sifting and searching examination of the available evidence, returned as its considered opinion that the origin of the miraculous medal must be recognized as entirely supernatural. 6 years after this, the medal was responsible for a most amazing conversion which astounded all Europe, that of Alphonse Ratisbonne, which occurred in Rome in 1842. Ratisbonne, a young and very wealthy Jewish banker of Strasbourg, set out, towards the end of 1841, on a tour of Eastern Europe as a prelude to his marriage with a rich and beautiful young woman of his own race. Determined to bypass Rome on his tour, for he had a contemptuous hatred of Catholicism, intensified by the recent conversion of his brother, Theodore, with whom he had broken off all relations, he nevertheless found himself drawn to the Eternal City by, in his own words, an invisible hand. Arrived there, he met, by chance, a friend, a devout Catholic named Count de Bussières. This friend insisted on giving Alphonse a miraculous medal and even hung it around the Jew's neck, to his great disgust. Though inwardly very angry, Alphonse submitted, through courtesy and as he told his friend. "Just to let you see that we Jews are not obstinate, and because you are my friend further." Count de Bussiers gave him a copy of the memo rare and made him promise to recite it once a day, despite himself. The words of the prayer impressed themselves on the young Jew's mind. They pursued him unceasingly, and he found himself repeating them continually, to quote his own words, like a musical tune which makes one impatient, but which cannot be got out of the ear. A few days later, the conversion took place in Rome, suddenly spectacularly, reminiscent of St. Paul's at Damascus. It was to have extraordinary repercussions all over Europe and even far beyond. Alphonse had entered the Church of St. Andrea della Frate with the Count, and the latter had left his companion for a short time, while he went to interview the parish priest. Ratisbonne, left alone in the dark church, and waiting somewhat impatiently for his friend, was suddenly dazzled by a bright light. Turning to it, he saw the Blessed Virgin in the attitude in which she was depicted on his medal. He fell down on his knees to pay homage, completely converted to Catholicism. He had entered the church altogether ignorant of, and prejudiced against the doctrines of the true faith. He rose from his knees, fully instructed in all its tenets, and in a short time he was baptized. Later, his engagement broken off by an irate fiancée, he entered the Jesuit order. He was ordained a priest and eventually joined the community of Our Lady of Sign, founded by his brother, Theodore, for the conversion of the Jews. Having lived a life of heroic virtue and sacrifice, he died in Jerusalem in 1884. When Alphonse Ratisbonne traveled to Paris after his conversion, he made strenuous efforts to meet the Sister of the Miraculous Medal, but in vain. As Catherine had already refused to meet the Archbishop of Paris, and was, later, to withhold her identity from Pope Gregory XVI, so she now hid herself in obscurity, declining to see the central figure of a conversion almost as dramatic and as unexpected as was that of St. Paul. Ratisbonne ardently desired to talk with the sister who had seen Mary, Queen of Heaven, as splendidly as she had appeared to him in Rome. He met Father Aladel and heard from his lips the details of the apparitions in the Rue du Bac, but not the name of the sister concerned. With that second best, and with his own fervent visits to the chapel of the sisters, this 29-year-old Jew, who had renounced for Christ all that this world holds dear, had to remain satisfied. In Rome, the wondrous conversion of Alphonse Ratisbonne served to turn the searchlight of interest on the medal. A thorough investigation into the causes of the conversion was held, and included a searching scrutiny of the whole history of the medal. There followed an official declaration by the Holy See in favor of the devotion inspired by the medal, the apparitions to St. Catherine in 1830 had confirmed an age-long belief of the faithful, soon to become, in 1854, dogma of faith pronounced by the infallible authority of the Church. As Lourdes in 1858 was the outward confirmation of that great dogma, so St. Catherine's visions in 1830 were the preparation for its definition. They were the opening chapters in the history of that special devotion to Mary Immaculate which spread with rapid enthusiasm over the entire world. In 1836, the year of the canonical inquiry, Sister Catherine, now 30 years old, was put in charge of the male pensioners in Enghien. Since 1831, she had been in the kitchen, and to this duty was soon added the care of the linen. During her first years at Enghien, her father died. Soon after, another and a heavier shadow fell across the path of her life. Her sister, Marie-Louise, after some quarrel of which we do not know the details, left in anger her house at Castel Saracen and the community of the Sisters of Charity and returned to the world. It is doubtful if anything in Catherine's long life saddened her as much as this defection by her elder sister, whom she had looked on as the very model of a daughter of St. Vincent de Paul. She sat down to write a letter of reproach to Marie-Louise. She, who rarely expressed her thoughts in writing, to whom the pen was a painful, laborious medium of address, must have been sore pressed to resort to this action. The letter, extant to this day, is a masterpiece of ordered thought and clear expression, a proof beyond doubt that this poor, simple Sister Catherine, devoid of spirit, but good at milking cows, was, in effect, a wise and prudent virgin, not lacking in her character a strong vein of irony. Let us ignore the faulty syntax, poor spelling, and wretched penmanship and concentrate on the essence of the letter. In it, Catherine enclosed a letter written to her by Marie-Louise in 1829, when she was working in their brother's restaurant in Paris. Marie-Louise's letter of some few years previously, couched in the florid style that marked the educated writing of the day, penned in glowing terms the life of sacrifice of a sister of charity. She had written to Catherine, "I love you too much not to rejoice with you in the attraction with which the good God has inspired you towards a vocation which is so dear to me. Could I but give you some faint idea of the blessings which it brings? What does it mean to be a daughter of charity? It means offering oneself to God without reserve, to serve Him and His poor, who are His sick members. It means compassion on all who are wretched and miserable, taking care of them in time of sickness, and helping them to die at peace with God. What a noble work, is it not? Through it we imitate the life of Jesus Christ. Spent in doing good, we become messengers of His mercy and ministers of His beneficence. He thus gives His heart to us and shows through us the love He has for the many children He puts under our care as apostles of His charity." At first sight, it would seem that a cloistered religious life were, in some ways, more perfect than ours. Immersed in contemplation, she, the contemplative, might think herself to be nearer to the Lord. From her place of concealment she could mourn like a dove and lift up her hands to heaven to implore the divine mercy. Yet the sister of charity adds the nobility of her works and the splendor of her victories to the pleadings of the contemplative. The nun is like a soldier who is guarding a strong fortress in time of peace. The daughter of charity, on the other hand, is like one who is facing the enemy. Both the one and the other deserve well of their country. But he who fights will be all the more honored in proportion, as his courage and fidelity have been put to the test. Our rule does not prescribe for us the austerities of haircloth or discipline. We make up for it by our work, which is often hard and repugnant to nature. In speaking thus, I am only adopting the language of the world, of those who do not understand the rewards and consolations of the heart. These consolations are so great that if at this moment I were offered the whole universe in exchange for them, I would cast it off as dust from my shoes, because I am convinced that if I possessed all the goods of this earth, I should not experience the contentment I feel in my vocation. It is not our custom to invite anybody to enter our community, but I hope the good God will pardon me for failing in regard to you. He knows that the salvation of your soul is as dear to my heart as my own. He knows how ardently I desire that you also should one day be found amongst those who will hear the consoling invitation of Jesus, "Come ye blessed of my Father, possess the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me to drink. I was a stranger, and you took me in. Naked, and you covered me. Sick, and you visited me. I was in prison, and you came to me." Here is a brief summary of the life of a daughter of charity. Now, 5 years later, Catherine referred to these passages with penetrating comment. "The good advice you gave me then and the promises you made me, apply them to yourself. Like an expert arrow, this letter struck home to the heart of things. For not long after it was received, Marie-Louise asked pardon for her defection, was accorded it, and returned in humility to her community. On May 1835, Sister Catherine made her first vows of poverty, chastity, obedience, and service to the poor. She was now an acknowledged member of the community to which St. Vincent de Paul had invited her in a dream, so many years before, and the commission which Our Lady had given her about the miraculous medal was being fulfilled. She thought then that it was time to urge Father Aladel to proceed to the execution of another commission which Our Blessed Lady had also given her. In reporting the first apparition to him, Sister Catherine said, "It is the Blessed Virgin's wish that you should found a confraternity of the children of Mary. She will give them many graces. The month of May will be kept with great splendor, and Mary will bestow abundant blessings upon them." Delays occurred, for Father Aladel was almost overwhelmed by various responsible duties in the two families. Sister Catherine, tormented by this postponement of Mary's expressed desire, returned to the offensive. At length, Father Aladel went ahead with the project. He had just been named the assistant director of the Congregation of the Vincentians, a development foretold by Our Lady to Catherine in 1830, when she disclosed to her that Father Aladel would soon have charge of the congregation in a special manner, and he was able to start. In his official capacity, associations of young girls formed to practice and promote devotion to the Blessed Virgin. These children of Mary's sodalities were first set up among the pupils and orphans in the schools and institutions under the care of the Sisters of Charity of St. Vincent de Paul. They were destined to spread all over the country and thence much farther afield. In 1847, Father Etienne, then Superior General of the Congregation, went to Rome, and in the course of his visit, obtained from Pope Pius IX, on June 20th, a formal pontifical approbation for the associations. The Pope granted the faculty of establishing in the schools of the Sisters of Charity a devout association in the name of the Most Holy and Immaculate Virgin, which would enjoy all the indulgences granted to the congregation of the Most Holy Virgin established in Rome for the pupils of the Society of Jesus. This congregation, canonically erected in 1584 for the pupils of Jesuit schools, was known as the Prima Primaria, or First Associations of the Children of Mary. The approbation of Pope Pius IX, given formally to Father Etienne, extended to the Daughters of Charity this canonical establishment of 1584, and thus their associations became a second primaria with all the privileges and indulgences of the first. The associations of the Children of Mary, under the care of the Sisters of Charity, spread widely and rapidly. In 1850, they were extended to the schools of the Vincentian Fathers. In 1876, they were extended more generally among young girls outside the schools of the Sisters. In 1877, the associations comprised 1,200 units with a total of 90,000 members. In 1925, there were 2,122 units with 150,000 members. Today, it would be impossible to reckon the number enrolled in these associations. In 1931, in memory of the centenary of the miraculous medal, Pope Pius XI, on March 25th, authorized the erection of an association of Children of Mary in every parish or institution, with the permission of the bishop. The badge of the Children of Mary is the miraculous medal, attached to a blue ribbon, and its principal feast is that of the Immaculate Conception, December 8th. Like the miraculous medal, the Association of Children of Mary met with a worldwide welcome. All this time, its instigator remained hidden in the obscure monotony of her life, minding the old men of Enghien and looking after the poultry for 40 long years. To anyone not imbued with God's love and devoted in self-sacrifice to His service, such a life would have proved one of insupportable tedium. To Sister Catherine, it was a joyful trial in preparation for her entrance into life eternal. He well-being, spiritual and corporal, of the poor old men of Enghien was Sister Catherine's chief duty for more than 40 years. And some of these old retainers were not only ill-tempered and infirm, they were also gross and disgusting in their habits. Then went no further than the local wine merchants, and arrived home to Sister Catherine in a wretched condition. She put them to bed, calmly, patiently, hiding her disgust from all eyes. On the morrow she would chide them gently for their intemperance, and, in particular, for the sin thereby committed against God. For very bad cases she had a terrible punishment, which she rarely inflicted to keep them in bed for 3 days, without permission to get up. Never did she show favoritism towards any particular one of her old patients. At table, the food was divided with strict fairness devoid of preference. It was the same when garments were distributed to the inmates. Their comfort was her great concern. At meals she would go around the tables asking, "Have you enough? Would you like more?" It was useless for the kitchen sister to complain that the old men were too generously served. In Sister Catherine's scheme of things, they took first place. One day, Sister Thomas, walking with Sister Catherine in the garden of Enghien, noticed some luscious plums and fruit. "How lovely," she exclaimed. "May I have a few, sister, please?" "Oh no, sister," was the reply. "Those are for my old people. If there are any left, you may have them, but there were never any left." As for the old folk, an astounding fact is worth recording during Sister Catherine's regime. They never made formal complaint of the treatment accorded them. Naturally, they were all enrolled in the miraculous medal. Sister Catherine saw to that. Some of them, by no means religious, took it reluctantly, or merely to please their kind sister in charge. It made no matter. Once they took the medal, they were converted, sooner or later. While Catherine was in charge, not one of them died without the last sacraments. All those we should call the hard cases returned, eventually, to the practice of the religion of their childhood. She stayed up all night praying for those who were in their last agony and consoling them, seeing that they received the last sacraments worthily, preparing them gently for the end. Her inward peace and confidence, her constant awareness of the presence of God, her sharing in the secrets of His Blessed Mother, became a tower of strength to these poor lonely creatures, who never intimidated her sublime humility. One of her many duties was the care of the hens, a joyful task. She loved to go out into the poultry yard scattering grain and chucking to them. She opened the coops and took out the eggs, set down the clutches and watched over the hatchings, minded the young chickens and petted the delicate ones. There were pigeons, too, to remind her of her old home in the Côte d'Or, pigeons that flew wildly about her as years before and flapped their wings impatiently for grain. Those old days in Fane had left an evil legacy to Catherine. From kneeling for hours on the damp flags of the little church, she had sown the seeds of chronic, painful arthritis which, from her 35th year, caused her ever-increasing suffering. She did not complain of it, and only through the reference of others do we ascertain its persistent, nagging presence. As Bernadette was destined never to taste solace from suffering in the waters of Massabielle, so Catherine was to suffer for years, unaided by the wonder-working metal which she had introduced to a stricken world. Suffering born in silence, self-sacrifice, mortification, these are the hallmarks of a saint. But another request from the Blessed Virgin had remained unanswered, to Catherine's great grief and disappointment. Our Lady had asked that a memorial be erected to commemorate her appearances in the chapel of the Sisters. It was to consist of an altar supporting a statue of Mary holding the world as a globe in her hands and offering the human race to God. This altar was to stand near the picture of Saint Joseph in the place where the Virgin of the globe had appeared. Sister Catherine was importuned for many years by the interior voice which she heard in her prayers asking for the erection of this altar and statue and for the establishment, in the community, of an annual general communion. In 1841, she set down these requests in a letter to Father Aladel, whom she had been verbally beseeching for 2 years. She wrote in the course of this letter, which also describes the apparitions, "Now I shall again ask you what I have been earnestly asking you for 2 years, to have an altar built to the Blessed Virgin in the same place as she appeared. At this moment more than ever I feel urged to mention this to you, and to beg for a general communion in the whole community each year. I ask you this 1,000 times and again 1,000 times to set my conscience at rest." In 1841, therefore, Father Aladel gave an order to the artist, Littale, to design a model of the Virgin holding the globe. But the result was so poor, so far from the beauty of her vision, that Catherine cried out in disappointment, and the project was allowed to lapse. Meanwhile, to stave off her importunities, Father Aladel had a high altar erected in the place of the apparition. Later, this altar was replaced by one of white marble, set somewhat further back and supporting a statue of the Virgin of the miraculous metal. But it was not the statue of the Virgin of the globe, and Catherine, to outward eyes devoted wholeheartedly to the menial work of her daily duties, was suffering much tribulation of soul. "That statue has been the martyrdom of my life," she was to say a few months before her death. Father Aladel kept her waiting from year to year, and finally in 1867 he died without having acceded to her request. It was this continued failure to carry out Mary's wish that caused Sister Catherine, by divine direction, to confide in her superior in 1876 and to ask once more, and this time more vehemently than ever, that the right statue be raised upon the altar. She could not die happily, nor at peace with Our Lady, until that memorial to Mary, advocate of humanity, Virgin most powerful, had been erected in the place where she had deigned to manifest herself to her humble messenger 46 years previously. The thread of Saint Catherine's life spun itself slowly, simply in an apparently monotonous pattern of uniformity, but she was always serene and cheerful. All her lowly duties were executed to perfection with the quiet composure of a soul constantly aware of the presence of God, conformable to His will in all things, however trivial they might appear. To quote the words of Pope Pius XI in her regard, under the surface of a hidden life of humility, simplicity, and of a pure and sincere devotion, there burnt in her an intense spiritual fire. When asked by one of the sisters whether she did not find her occupations tiresome, she replied, "Tiresome. When you do the will of God, you never think the work small or tedious." Pope Benedict XV statement that sanctity consists solely in conformity with the divine will, expressed in a continuous and exact fulfillment of the duties of one's own state of life, applies with special emphasis to Saint Catherine Laboure. Saint Vincent de Paul had founded the congregation of his Daughters of Charity that God might be supremely loved. Conformity to His will was, in Saint Vincent's eyes, the most perfect proof of charity in one's heart. He taught his daughters that the perfection of love does not consist in ecstasies, but in performing well the will of God, and he will be the most perfect amongst all men who will have conformed his own will to that of God. Wherefore, our perfection consists in uniting our will so closely to God's that His will and ours should form but one, and he who excels most in this will be the most perfect, judged by these standards alone. Catherine Laboure emerges as a great saint. Not that she was devoid of keen feeling in her relations with others. On the contrary, she was sensitive above the ordinary, especially as she grew older. She felt injustice and severity with an interior agitation which forced her, at times, to hurry to the chapel, and there, humbled before God, restore herself to the peace of interior calm. Her superior at Rioli, Sister Doofs, a worthy, practical woman of courage and common sense, seemed always reluctant to appreciate Sister Catherine's great merit and heroic practice of virtue. Many a time Sister Doofs upbraided her harshly for negligence for which Catherine was in no way to blame. And Catherine, though innocent, would fall on both knees, accepting, in full, the sharp scoldings which should have been given to someone else. By a word she could have freed herself from all censure. Always, however, her humility triumphed. So severe and harsh were these scoldings that one of the sisters, Sister Cosnard, once ventured to ask Sister Doofs how she could be so hard on the saintly old sister. The superior replied, "Sister, let me be. I feel it my duty to act thus." And Sister Cosnard saw, in this strange reply, an especial plan of providence to increase the glory of his saint. Had not many great saints to submit from time to time to galling misunderstandings from UN-sympathetic superiors? In one regard, Sister Catherine was firm, almost to the point of severity. That was if anyone tried to link her up with the apparitions of 1830, or to trap her into an admission of her part therein. For many years the sisters had often looked in veiled curiosity at one another, wondering who was the chosen one. We can imagine the stolen glances from beneath one cornet to another, the surreptitious little watchings of one another at prayer or in meditation. The whisper had gone round, started, no doubt, by Catherine's old friend, Sister Sejols, who made no secret of her belief that the paltry sister at Rioli was the seer of the visions. It was difficult to believe this, for Catherine spoke naturally of the apparitions, as though she knew no more about them than any other sister, and always she spoke of the seer in the third person. One day, two young postulants just finished their postulation in Rioli, and starting off for their novitiate in Rue du Bac, came to see Sister Catherine before they set out. Young, eager, expecting no doubt great spiritual experiences ahead of them, they hoped to prize a little hint from Sister Catherine, if not a frank avowal as to the identity of the sister of the apparitions. They said to her, "Sister, we leave for Rue du Bac tomorrow. Tell us something of the Blessed Virgin." Looking coldly at them, Catherine replied, "Well then, young ladies, pray hard to Our Lady and try to profit by your novitiate." They succeeded as well in their errand as did Monseigneur Pages, secretary to the coadjutor of Paris, and later vicar general of the diocese. Hearing a rumor that Sister Catherine might possibly be the sister of the miraculous medal, he made some excuse to call upon her. Sister Catherine opened the door of Enghien to his knock, for she was portress at the time. He spoke with her. But when his conversation veered round, cleverly, to the apparitions, she turned to go, as one who would know nothing of the matter, and said courteously, "Monsignor, I shall look for the superior for you." She did not return. During the last few years of her life, Sister Catherine, infirm, crippled with arthritis, acted as portress at Enghien, sitting in her little lodge beside the door and hobbling out, painfully, on her stick to answer the knocks. A sister who sometimes dropped in to see her in this lodge once took her by surprise. Pointing to a poor-looking statue of the Blessed Virgin, in front of which they had just recited the Rosary, she said to Sister Catherine, "Do you think that the Blessed Virgin who appeared to one of us looked ugly like that statue?" The answer was a gentle smile which, telling nothing, put an end to that topic of conversation. She was very firm, one day, with a young sister who declared aloud her belief that the visions in the Rue du Bac were but an illusion. Coming out of her customary reserve, her time-honored rule of not discussing these events, Sister Catherine bridled a little and said with forthright conviction, "My dear, the sister who saw the Blessed Virgin saw her in flesh and blood. In 1858, the world hummed and seethed with the news of the apparitions at Lourdes. The peasant child, Bernadette, had seen, above a rose bush in Massabielle, a lovely lady, like the Blessed Virgin depicted on the miraculous medal suspended, at the time, around Bernadette's neck. After 6 weeks of asking the lady her name, Bernadette was at last rewarded by the answer, 'I am the Immaculate Conception.' Did Catherine Laboure resent that another had seen the Mother of God and been the recipient of heavenly confidences? Did she, Catherine, withhold belief in the visions of the poor, almost illiterate peasant girl? Far from it. Sister Catherine spoke of the apparitions at Lourdes with keen and eager interest, following and explaining the details and events more clearly. It was remembered N.A.N. voti sistir. Not lortias titianahan nai or henner, or forowas not nor titinealast. Last. A movement in that great Marianne symphony, of which the apparitions in the Rue du Bac had been the first movement, and the dogma of the Immaculate Conception, pronounced in 1854, the triumphant climax? before her death, when divine ordinance had partly opened those lips guarding. Their secret for 46 years, Catherine said one day to Sister Dufys, her superior and confidante. When the Blessed Virgin appeared to Bernadette, she said, "I am the Immaculate Conception you see." Then, that she was our own lady. Among Catherine's few worldly pleasures, a visit to her darling sister Tonine, now Madame Monnier de Vizerny, was especially enjoyed. Tonine had 2 children, a daughter who became Madame d'Hamel and lived to give beatification process, and a son, Philip, who became a Vincentian father. From his early years, Catherine recognized his vocation and fostered it carefully. At the end of his secondary studies, she had introduced him, herself, to the Vincentian College of Montdidier. He came to see her at Rioli, and she said to him lightly, "You know, if you wish to become a Vincentian father, you will be accepted. You might soon become a superior, travel in many countries and go on the missions as far as China, like Blessed Purboyer. But from China you might also return." He was then 17 years old. He took these remarks as a piece of teasing on the part of his loving Aunt Zoe, but all her words came true. Early in his priestly career, Father Midniet was sent to the Far East, whence, after long and responsible service, he was recalled to France to take up the office of assistant to the Congregation of the Mission and director of the Daughters of Charity. In 1863, an exciting event occurred to break the monotony of life at Rioli. The paper factory next door went on fire, the flames leaping to alarming heights on every side. A panic-stricken crowd gathered in the street were shouting frantically, "The sisters will be burned alive." In Rioli, fear and anxiety spread rapidly among the sisters, and white cornets could be seen flying up and down stairs, running along corridors and out into the courtyard, in an effort to save as much as possible, should evacuation already threaten be inevitable. But Sister Catherine arrived on the scene, limping along from Enghien, her rosary in her hand. She addressed the sisters calmly. "My good sisters, why excite yourselves needlessly? The Blessed Virgin is looking after the house and no evil will touch it. Rest assured." And the fire continued to eat up the house next door without doing the least damage to Rioli. A few years before the Franco-Prussian War of 1870, which was to overwhelm Paris with death and disaster, Sister Catherine was called to the Mother House by the most honored Mother de Vos, Mother General of the congregation. The sister of the poultry yard, now 60 years of age, got herself ready and traveled on the outside of the coach to the Mother House, all unwitting of what lay in store for her. For Mother de Vos, having chatted at length and asked many questions, said suddenly, "What would you say, Sister Laboure, if I were to name you sister servant of our house in naming a certain street?" Poor Sister Catherine almost collapsed with astonishment. All she could say was, "Oh, most honored Mother, you must know that I am not capable of it. Do you think so?" asked Mother de Vos. "Why," certainly came the prompt reply. "You have only to ask any of the sisters about that." Mother de Vos had her own opinion on this question, for she had made searching inquiries beforehand and had found that Enghien was run like clockwork, with perfect order. The old men's clothes were kept in model condition. The receipts and expenses account of the poultry yard were a source of admiration to all who saw them, every figure clear and in its right place, with never an error. To these, as to all her lowly duties, Sister Catherine applied her wholehearted attention. Further, Sister Dufys, superior of the House of Rioli and also of that in Enghien, had been leaving the management of the latter almost wholly to Sister Catherine, who had been given all the keys and was placed at the superior's right hand at table, as if she were the official and not merely the virtual assistant superior. But Sister Catherine continued to insist with vehemence that she was not fit to become a sister servant, and Mother de Vos finished by becoming convinced of this herself. Sister Catherine was sent back to Enghien. Can we fail to see here the pattern of the divine plan that, in the terrible days to come, during the siege of Paris, and in particular during the reign of terror of the Commune of 1871, Sister Catherine would, in her simple, humble way, play a leading part in the terrifying scenes to be enacted in the life of the sisters in Rioli, when the Blessed Virgin appeared to Saint Catherine on the night of July 19, 1830. She spoke with tears in her eyes of the disasters that would occur in some 40 years' time, saying, "Misfortunes will fall upon France. There will be victims among the clergy of Paris. The Archbishop will die. The cross will be despised. It will be thrown down to the ground. The side of our Savior will be reopened. The streets will run with blood. The whole world will be stricken." Mary had foretold a grave crisis for the 2 families of Saint Vincent. Great danger will come upon them. It will seem as if everything is lost. Have confidence, do not be discouraged. I shall be with you. You will have the protection of God and of Saint Vincent in both communities. In 1870, great dark clouds of war and suffering loomed up over France. Civil strife in Paris, with all its attendant evils, was to follow. This was the year of the Siege of Paris, one of the most ruthless in history. For 135 days, the German army laid siege to the French capital, cutting off, effectively, all aid from the main French army, now isolated in various sections and surrounded by the enemy. King Wilhelm, with Bismarck and General Moltke, took up quarters in the estate of the Rothschilds at Ferrieres, outside Paris, to await surrender of the beleaguered city. During the autumn and winter of 1870 to 1871, the people of Paris suffered all the horrors of war, death, disease, famine, and bombardment. The infant mortality was enormous. Food supplies soon began to run out, and during the last month of the siege, the dreadful January of 1871, only those of the citizens who could call daily for their rations received them 2 os of bread and 1 os of horseflesh. The animals in the zoological gardens Le Jardin des Plantes were sacrificed to the hunger of the populous camel, porcupine and elephant being considered dainties as compared with the common dish of horse, dog, and rat. Bombardment of the city proper began on January 6th, not for military purposes but to demoralize the civilians. Parisians retired to live in their cellars, venturing out between salvos of shells to pick up souvenirs of molten metal. General Trochu, governor of Paris and president of the Provisional Government for Republic III, had been proclaimed in Paris on September 6th, following news of the defeat of the French army at Sedan and the imprisonment by the Prussians of the Emperor Napoleon III. Was in charge of the besieged city. At first, his policy, a masterpiece of passive resistance with sporadic sallies, was to temporize, pending the expected arrival of help from some part of the main French army. But when bombardment started, the Parisians clamored for reprisals and Trochu began a definite offensive. Within the city, things were organized for total resistance. A blackout was effected each night to counteract the determined shelling which continued to devastate thickly populated districts. Food rationing was introduced and ration cards were distributed to the people. A giant cannon fund was inaugurated and thousands of people, organizations and government departments, subscribed for their own cannon to help to defend Paris. The postal authorities called their cannon the telegraph and engraved on it the motto, "Not an inch of our territory nor a stone of our fortresses." Every few days, sometimes twice in a day, balloons left Paris, carrying passengers, mail, and pigeons to bring back news from outside. But once the pilot in charge had taken off, he had to trust to fate for his eventual landing place. Some of the balloons came down in different parts of France. Some in Norway, Holland, Belgium, and even as far as Prussia and as near as the German lines outside the city of Paris. Many of the letters were written on a blank page of a flimsy printed news sheet, the Gazette des Absents. Later on in the history of this quaint airmail, a system was devised whereby each pigeon could carry several thin sheets of collodion on which written messages could be photographically reproduced in a greatly reduced size. This was the forerunner of the aircraft service started by Lord Wavell for troops in the Near East in 1941. Forerunner of the first anti-aircraft gun was the balloon musket, designed and produced by Krupps to fire on the balloons. Mounted on a 4-wheeled platform, which could be horse-drawn to the scene of action, this gun swung vertically and horizontally, as directed by the gunner who sat in a special seat behind it. The Germans won the day. An armistice was negotiated at the end of January, and all France went to the polls in February to vote on the issue. War or peace, peace was the verdict. And on March 1st, 30,000 Prussian soldiers entered Paris in triumph to hold a 48 hours occupation of the vanquished city. On March 3rd, they departed from an angry, sullen capital, assured of a peace treaty which was to prove the prelude to another and a worse war between France and Germany, that of 1914 to 1918. Meanwhile, what had happened to Sister Catherine and her companions? Like all the citizens of Paris, they took part in the organization of the city. Rioli was commandeered as a hospital, and the sick and wounded brought there were tended by the sisters. Sister Catherine was compelled, also, to receive a number of cases in the old men's hospice of Enghien. The sisters were charged by the mayor of their ward with the distribution of victuals to all the small hospital centers in the district. They gave out more than 1,200 rations of food each morning and evening. Bad as was their plight during the bitter siege, it was immeasurably worse in the Civil War and Second Siege which followed. The Prussians' departure from the bleeding, broken city was succeeded by a fortnight of restless, seething uncertainty, a smoldering political resentment which burst into the fierce flames of civil strife. A republic had been proclaimed in Paris in September 1870 after the fall of the emperor. But in February, after the siege of Paris, the French elections returned a huge royalist majority, in defiance of the left-wing policy of Paris and many of the provincial cities. Thiers was appointed chief of the executive power, and the National Assembly was convened to meet at Versailles on March 20th to decide what form the future constitution of France would take. Seeing their opportunity, the extremists in Paris struck suddenly. On March 18th, they seized the city, raised barricades, and declared a state of government known to French history ever since as Le Commune. Thiers, head of the cabinet at Versailles, and Marshal MacMahon, commander-in-chief of the French army in the same place, were forced to lay a second siege to Paris, and Bismarck, looking on cynically, threatened that if the French government could not quell the Communards' rebels in their own ranks, he would march back his Germans to restore order in Paris. Once again was Paris besieged and beleaguered. Once again was the Seine to flow under her low bridges, red with blood and wild with the light of torches. Once again was the most cultured, most sophisticated city in the world to suffer the horrors of civil strife. March 18th, 1871, the date of the proclamation of the Commune in Paris, was a day that spelled disaster to many of the clergy and religious communities in the city. Really, like the other religious houses, had been inspected by the hostile Communards, now in full charge of the city. The sisters stayed on at their posts, not knowing what to expect from day to day. One evening at recreation time, they were gathered together in the big community room on the ground floor. To everyone's surprise, Sister Catherine, usually so silent, spoke out clearly to the superior, Sister Dufes, at whose right hand she sat. "Sister, I must tell you that I had a dream last night. The Blessed Virgin came to look for you here in the community room. Not finding you, she looked into your cabinet, but you were not there either. Then she sat down in your chair at your desk and said to me, since Sister Dufes is not here, you will tell her that she can go away in peace of mind. I am taking over this house and I shall look after it. She will go south with Sister Claire and will return on May 31st. Sister Dufes smiled indulgently, but made no verbal comment on this dream. The other sisters, interested if not credulous, spoke of the dream among themselves. And Sister Claire of Aragon, who was not present but heard of the incident, came next day to Sister Catherine and made her repeat her dream, item by item. At this, Sister Catherine, fearful lest anyone might think she had had a revelation, turned to the superior and said, "You understand, sister, that what I have told you was but a dream." All her life she differentiated with scrupulous care between her dreams and her visions. She had seen Vincent's heart in visions. She had seen Saint Vincent himself in a dream. The apparitions of the Blessed Virgin in 1830 had been visions seen with her own eyes in flesh and blood. This last prophetic glimpse of things to come in the course of the Commune was but a dream. "Oh, I thought no further of it," replied Sister Dufes in airy reassurance. She and her sisters were to dwell deeply on it, later when the events foretold had come to pass. In Rioli, matters hurried to a dangerous climax. During the next few days, the Communards took over all the ground floor of the house, and the sisters were virtually imprisoned on the first floor. Sister Catherine, old, calm, serene, was the liaison officer between the sisters and the soldiers. Worse than the soldiers were the female Communards, fanatical women capable of any cruelty, imbued with a fierce hatred of religion and its practices. Paris can always produce their type of womanhood at a moment's notice. One seems to see their forebears in the sinister creatures who sat knitting as they counted head_S at the foot of the guillotine. One wonders whether the large, grim, gruesome-looking women of the Bastille Quarter and the Halles are not, in truth, their descendants. Good Friday, April 7th. Armed Communards arrived at Rioli to demand the surrender of 2 policemen wounded in the street and given refuge in the hospital of the sisters. These 2 had been condemned to be shot by their enemies. Sister Dufes was called upon to identify the men and to deliver them up to execution. Her calm reply was never. Sullenly they departed to take further counsel. On Sunday, Easter Sunday, they returned to Rioli, headed by the new mayor. The demand for the surrender of the 2 policemen was repeated and again refused. One of the soldiers rushed at Sister Dufes, his sword upraised to strike her head. "Do not touch me," she commanded, and the sword was lowered. The revolutionaries penetrated into Rioli, searching everywhere for their victims. One of the pursued, who was but slightly wounded, got himself dressed hurriedly and fled through the hospice of Enghien. The other was successfully disguised among the wounded patients. Enraged at their failure, the mayor ordered Sister Dufes to be arrested and brought to the prison of Saint Lazare. Immediately, all her sisters, 40 in number, formed themselves into a long file behind her, determined to follow. The procession had just passed the threshold when the mayor, baffled by this turn of events, countermanded his order. "What am I to do with these scared swallows?" was his exasperated exclamation. Sister Dufes was set free. But the mayor's parting words carried a horrible menace. "Tomorrow you will hear further from me." On the morrow, before the summons for her arrest arrived, Sister Dufes had fled, by carriage, to the house of the Sisters of Charity in Versailles. After a few days, she sent a message to Rioli for Sister Claire to accompany her southwards to Toulouse. Thus was fulfilled the first part of Sister Catherine's strange dream. At Enghien, during this reign of terror, Sister Catherine remained calm and cheerful. Sitting in her lodge, she was now portress reassuring the sisters and distributing miraculous medals, even to the communard soldiers who came to her asking for them as for a charm. "But you poor creatures," she would say to them, "you have neither faith nor religion. What use is the medal to you?" "True for you, sister," they would reply. "We don't believe in much. But we believe in this medal. It has protected others, it will protect us too. And if we have to go under fire, it will help us to die bravely." At Rioli, the communard in charge made an effort to discipline his followers. One of them, a woman, who had been violently abusive to the sisters, was court-martialed, and Sister Catherine was called to give evidence on her misconduct. The 65-year-old sister, shaking her head emphatically under her big white cornet, refused to proffer any charge. "I do not believe that she deserves punishment," was her statement. Nothing could shake her, and the citizeness was allowed to go free. But things were growing more and more dangerous for the communards, and tempers were rising rapidly. On Saturday, April 29th, Sister Catherine herself was brought between two soldiers, as a prisoner, before an improvised tribunal at Rioli. She was submitted to a strict verbal cross-examination about the two policemen who had escaped the violence of their pursuers earlier in the month. All she would say was that she had seen them go away. The soldiers laughed coarsely, uproariously, treating her as a huge joke and dismissing her without ceremony. That very Saturday evening, the soldiers indulged in a bout of heavy drinking in their headquarters, the community room on the ground floor. The sisters, clustered together on the floor immediately above, heard the drunken carousals, the horrid threats, the foul language of their captors. For fear of desecration, they brought the sacred host from the chapel to a place of safety in the classroom where they were gathered. Louder, coarser, more intoxicated grew the brawl downstairs. There was a general movement of drunken soldiers towards the door of the community room, and to their horror, the sisters heard them prepare to come upstairs. Like the early Christians, not knowing what awful fate might be theirs, the sisters divided the sacred species among themselves and communicated. Immediately, Sister Cosnard, in charge, began to recite aloud the prayers of thanksgiving. Heavily weighted by wine, the steps came nearer. A few strong blows shook the door, drowning Sister Cosnard's voice of prayer. "Have no fear," said Sister Catherine to her companions. They opened the door. Before them stood the communard leader, sodden with drink, uttering vile abuse. The sisters held conference with him, calmly, quietly, as though he were in full charge of his senses. And he, sobered somewhat by the sight of these good women, who were so dignified, so courteous, so completely in possession of their emotions, pulled himself together sharply and apologized for the intrusion, declaring that his soldiers had got out of hand. Then he threw himself across the doorway and shouted to his followers that any one of them who touched these good sisters would first have to step over his dead body. This decisive act saved the sisters. But on the morrow they conferred upon the situation and decided that it was too dangerous to remain any longer. They went away quietly in little bands to different convents where they found refuge. Sister Catherine was one of the last to go. Before leaving, she went with her companion to the statue of the Blessed Virgin in the garden, that statue which she never passed on her way between Enghien and Rioli without stopping to say a Hail Mary so devotedly, with such rapt attention that the sisters would dodge behind the bushes just to see the radiance in her face. Now she prayed Our Lady to mind the house in their absence, and to bring them back home before the end of her own month of May. This done, she took the crown from the head of the statue and wrapped it reverently in a piece of white linen. It was 6 o'clock on Sunday evening, April 30th, when Sister Catherine and her companion left Really on their way to St. Denis. Challenged at the door by the sentries, they were asked to give up for examination the blue linen bag which held their few poor belongings. All the contents were scattered on the ground to the huge joy and coarse ridicule of the onlookers. Having gathered up their bits and pieces, the two sisters got into their carriage and drove off. They were escorted through the streets as far as the throne barrier by a mob of wild women who jeered, hissed and hurled insults at them and provoked the children to do likewise. It was such a mob as Paris, albeit the city of art and culture, seems able, in every generation, to summon at a moment's notice. At St. Denis, when they arrived, there was room for only one sister. Sister Catherine, old and infirm, was obviously the one to remain, but she would not allow her companion to go on alone. Bravely, suffering incessant pain from her swollen limb, looking the picture of death and agony, she continued on to Boulainvilliers, where they both found refuge. From here, she wrote a very long letter to Sister Dufes at, no doubt, great cost of time and vitality, telling her that they would return to Really on May 31st. Meanwhile, what was happening in Really and Enghien, now at the mercy of the communards? A riot of sacrilegious atrocities followed the departure of the sisters. The soldiers took up irreverent residence in the chapel. They tried to pull down the statue of Mary Immaculate above the altar. They tied ropes around it and pulled with might and main, but without success. Mad with anger at this failure, they drew their guns and fired shots, traces of which remain to this day on the statue, but nothing could dislodge it. At Enghien, the soldiers tried to throw routine and order into utter confusion. Here, to their amazement, they were countered by the quiet determination of the old inmates who said with finalative, "Sister Catherine would do this, we shall do the same. Sister Catherine would not do that, we shall not do it either." The clergy of Paris were hunted and their churches defiled. Monsignor Darboy, the Archbishop of Paris, was arrested by the Commune for being a servant of one who is called God and thrown into prison. On May 24th, he and a band of priests hostages were executed. Thiers had refused to exchange them for a band of prisoners, including the communard leader, Blanqui. 5 days before this execution of the hostages, Father Chinchon, spiritual director of the Sisters of Charity and of the Vincentian students, revealed that the executions had been prophesied by a Sister of Charity. Father Serpet, a future superior of the Vincentian house in Dax, was among those who heard the prophecy. He gave sworn evidence of this before the beatification process in 1907. Father Chinchon had arrived in Dax from Paris on May 19th, having taken advantage of the permission to leave the beleaguered city, given by the Commune to men over 40 years of age. He was surrounded by his young students, delighted to see their director and clamoring for news of events in Paris. He told them that, according to the written accounts of a Sister of Charity, whose manuscript he held in his hands at the time of speaking, the Archbishop and the priests held as hostages would die under the Commune. That very afternoon, Father Chinchon read to Father Serpet a passage from the manuscript, foretelling the violent death of the Archbishop. He also read further prophetical excerpts to both Father Serpet and Father Lacour, the superior of Dax. 5 days later, the executions took place. They were announced in Dax to the forewarned horror of the Vincentian priests and students. Our Lady had said to Catherine, with tears in her eyes, "There will be victims among the clergy of Paris. The Archbishop will die." The Church of Our Lady of Victories was savagely sacked on May 18th. News of this reached Sister Catherine at Boulainvilliers, and she said, "They have touched Our Lady of Victories. Their own triumph is at an end." On May 21st, the French troops from Versailles broke through the communard lines near Auteuil and, soon after, pressed into Paris, though too late to save the Archbishop. On May 30th, Sister Dufes left Toulouse and came to Boulainvilliers that she might travel to Paris with Sister Catherine and her companion. They reached Really on May 31st and found that both it and Enghien were in a habitable state, preserved from mob looting by the Children of Mary, who had taken over both houses. Paris had suffered terribly during the last days of the Commune. Many of the most historic buildings and churches were set on fire by the insurgents, and firemen who tried to extinguish the flames were shot down. The Tuileries, home of the kings of France, and dating from 1564, blazed for 3 days and 3 nights, and having smoldered for 10 further days, broke into fire again. So fierce were the flames from all the fires in the city that at night a newspaper could be read by their light as far away as Versailles. The army of Marshal MacMahon entered a city of desolation. Thiers, septuagenarian leader of the victorious government, meted out savage retribution to the vanquished commonards, and Paris once more suffered a nightmare of trial and punishment. Back at Rioli, Sister Catherine unwrapped the Blessed Virgin's crown from its covering and replaced it upon the head of the statue. As she had promised, Mary had preserved the two families from destruction during the reign of terror of the Commune. Back again in her beloved Enghien, Sister Catherine resumed her daily routine of prayer and work. The years were telling on her. She suffered much from arthritis and could move about only with the help of a stick. She was still in charge of the welfare of the old men and sat at meals, as before, on the right hand of Sister Dufes. But she was not officially the assistant superior, as no such appointment had yet been made. In 1873, it was decided that Sister Dufes should have an officially appointed assistant, and she was allowed to make her choice. One would have thought that she would pick Sister Laboure without a second's hesitation, had not this gentle old sister worked hard for more than 40 years in the service of the old men. Was not her record of order and organization a model one, free from blemish? Had she not acted, unofficially, as the superior's assistant for many a long year? Alas! A little reflection on Sister Catherine, her age, her lack of education, her lameness decided Sister Dufes against the obvious choice. In Rioli there was a splendid young sister, Sister Angelique Tanguy, bright, brisk, well-educated and intelligent above the ordinary, who seemed designed to fill the part of assistant superior, in charge of Enghien. Sister Catherine was therefore informed by Sister Dufes that henceforth she would have to surrender the keys of Enghien each evening to Sister Tanguy, whom from that time onwards she must consult, and whose consent she must obtain before taking any decisive action in Enghien. O hardest of all tasks for old age, to yield to youth, to bow to its superiority, to ask its permission and await its consent. That was Sister Catherine's great trial after she had served fully and faithfully for more than 40 years. The appointment came as an unexpected blow upon her. 77, without showing by voice or manner any sense of injustice or ingratitude on the part of her superior, Sister Catherine smiled and said to Sister Dufes, "You may rest assured. It is enough for me that my superiors have spoken. Sister Angelique will be received as a representative of the good God and will be obeyed as scrupulously that evening." She gave her place in the refectory to the new assistant. Never did she show the slightest envy or discontent at the change. At the close of each day, she brought the keys of Enghien to Sister Angelique and handed them up deferentially. Everyone knew that Sister Catherine had been passed over, rejected, set aside. It was not the least of the great victories of her humility. And yet, as is often the case in old age, Sister Catherine was growing more sensitive than ever, and less successful at disguising her emotions. There was that instance. Of the sick pigeon, delicate little member of a newly hatched brood, on which Sister Catherine was lavishing special attention to preserve its life. She had now an assistant, Sister Manuel, to help her in the poultry yard, and to her she entrusted the care of the little pigeon, in its special niche, unable to fly around like its brothers, in search of food. But Sister Manuel, busy with many occupations, forgot all about her little patient, and Sister Catherine, going one day to watch its progress, found it had died of hunger. Overcome with grief, she could not prevent herself exclaiming reproachfully to Sister Manuel, "And I gave you such instructions about it." Then there is the story of the two postulants in Rioli during the summer of 1872, Mademoiselle Gabrielle, who had so many rich relatives and friends, and Mademoiselle Marie, who was all alone. One day, MLA. Gabrielle's parents drove up in a grand carriage to the door of Rioli and, with permission, brought her out for the whole day. Sister Catherine, seeing the sad inequality between the two postulants, went to Sister Dufes and asked permission to go to the Rue du Bac and to take MLA, Marie, with her. They went out into the heat of a summer's day, young Marie. Marie delighted with this small break in routine, old Sister Catherine dragging herself painfully, leaning on her stick, hoisting herself with difficulty into a coach which took them part of the way. Arrived at the Rue du Bac, they were greeted by Sister Cosnard, who, seeing Sister Catherine's radiant face, said to her teasingly, "Aha, I think MLA, Marie is a special little pet of yours, upon my word." Came the spirited rejoinder of Marie, "Gabrielle can go riding in a carriage, surely MLA. Marie can be allowed to walk." But a worse blow than that of the assistant superiorship was to fall on this elderly, infirm sister. In 1876, her confessor, Father Chinchon, the one and only living confidant of the great revelations and apparitions, was ordered by the superior general of the two communities to devote his time entirely to the seminarists and students, and to give over to another immediately. The spiritual direction of the Sisters of Charity. Sister Catherine's deep, sensitive interior life was shaken to the core. The Blessed Virgin had laid a charge upon her, not yet fulfilled, to have erected, in the place of the apparitions, an altar bearing the statue of Our Lady holding the globe. For years, Sister Catherine had begged and beseeched Father Aladel to carry out this mission, and he, after a few ineffective attempts, had died in 1867, the mission unaccomplished. Catherine had since confided in Father Chinchon all her secrets of the apparitions. We can imagine how much this change of confessor must have cost her tender, sensitive soul. But Father Chinchon had not done anything definite yet to realize Mary's wishes in regard to the altar and statue. Now, suddenly, unexpectedly, he was to be taken from the sisters and replaced by another confessor. For Catherine, at 70 years of age, to tell a new confessor the full details of the great events of 46 years ago, to explain to him the intimacy which she had enjoyed ever since with the Blessed Virgin, was a task that seemed beyond her failing physical powers. She knew that death was drawing near, yet she dared not face it before accomplishing her charge. How begin at her age, all over again, the campaign she had thought all but won? Her whole world seemed to be falling about hearers. In desperation, she decided to appeal to the superior general, Father Bohr, in an effort to retain her confessor. Having obtained permission, she went to Rue de Sèvres and was shown into the presence of that very important Vincentian, the superior general of the two families. He saw before him a nervous old sister, distressed and worried, asking him vehemently to let her continue confessing to Father Chinchon. Kindly but firmly he told her that he could not make any exception to the rule, and sent her away without further parley. She returned to Really. And there Sister Dufys, who had never seen Sister Catherine anything but calm and self-possessed, apparently devoid of emotion, was shocked to see her face bathed in painful, piteous tears. Astonished, startled into sympathy, Sister Dufys hastened to speak kindly to her, and hearing the cause of her sorrow, to point out that no exception could possibly be made. God will look after it all for you, she said, to comfort Sister Catherine. And now Sister Catherine turned her tear-stained face to Sister Dufys and said, "Sister, I shall not live much longer. But since the Blessed Virgin told me not to confide in anyone but my confessor, I cannot tell you anything until I have first sought her direction and gained her permission, in prayer. If she tells me to speak to you, I shall do so. If not, I shall not." Sister Dufys heard these words with an indescribable emotion. True, she had heard rumors, years ago, connecting the poor poultry sister with the great apparitions, but she had never taken them seriously. Now, for the first time, she sensed the divine presence in Sister Catherine. She replied that she would be ready to hear Sister Catherine whenever the latter so wished. They parted until next day. Next morning, Catherine did not come to seek Sister Dufys, who was waiting in anxious impatience. At o'clock a message reached her asking her to go over to the parlor at Ingien. She went immediately. Sister Catherine was waiting for her. They greeted each other and remained standing. There, in the sisters' parlor, Sister Dufys heard all the details of the astounding revelations and apparitions of 46 years ago. The Angelus rang at 12 o'clock, and they were still standing opposite each other, talking, explaining, questioning, and discussing. The visions of 1830 had by now passed into history, and the few details generally known were blurred, if not completely forgotten. When Sister Catherine explained clearly, item by item, the need for the erection of a statue of Our Lady holding the world as a globe in her hands, and offering it to her divine Son, Sister Dufys, who knew only of the miraculous medal, interrupted impatiently. But there was never any question of a globe in the Blessed Virgin's hands. If we claim that, everyone will say that we are losing our reason. Listen to Sister Catherine's prompt reply. It would not be the first time that I lay been called a fool, but I shall say to my dying breath that Our Lady appeared to me holding the globe of the world in her hands. What a difference between the simple old sister of the Oultry yard, uneducated and retiring, and this clear-leaded, determined old sister who spoke so definitely and knew exactly what she wanted. Sister Dufys was amazed. When she argued against the new statue, saying you will take from the importance of the medal with this talk of the Blessed Virgin with a globe, Sister Catherine replied decisively, no. Let the medal be left exactly as it is, but have a statue made of the Blessed Virgin with the globe and set it on an altar in the spot where she appeared. She added, "This statue has been the martyrdom of my life. I would not wish to appear before Our Lady if I had not accomplished her will in this regard. Her master stroke of repartee was you have only to get records of all this from Sister Pino, the sacristan, and Sister Marie Grant, the secretary in the mother house during Father Aladel's time." Sister Dufes fell on her knees before the old sister whom she had so often rebuked without reason, whom at times she had almost despised as simple and foolish. She begged pardon of one so privileged. "I privileged?" asked Sister Catherine. "I have only been Our Lady's mouthpiece. She did not come for my sake, for I can do nothing. She appeared for the sake of the community." It was her firm conviction always that heaven had chosen her as its humble instrument. So as to leave no one in doubt, one thing, and one alone she desired of this interview, that an altar be erected in the place of the apparitions, and on it be set a statue of Mary, Virgin most powerful, advocate of all the world. Inquiries were set afoot. The detached, impersonal records of the Secretariat were examined. The rejected design by Leteil in 1841 of the Virgin of the Globe was brought to light. The Sisters Pino and Grant were examined. Everything corroborated Sister Catherine's statement to Sister Dufes. Father Chevalier, her new confessor, directed Sister Catherine to furnish him with written accounts of the apparitions. Soon the statue was ordered from the sculptor, Frock Robert, and soon Sister Catherine was able to see the first representation in statuary of the Virgin of the Globe. It fell far short of her radiant memories of Mary's divine beauty. But it was a good earthly attempt, and Sister Catherine had to be satisfied. Her mission was now fulfilled. All Mary's instructions were either effected or in course of achievement, and Sister Catherine Laboure could now die in peace.